Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a brand new, exclusive series written by a fan and subscriber of the show by the name of Mr. Savage. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR? And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled The Nightmare of Winter. Part 1. Let's get straight into that. It was a little after 4 p.m. on a Friday. I shivered a little in the cold, wet wind of a mid-December Georgia afternoon. I only had about an hour left of outdoor construction before I could call it a day, collect my wages, and start my long-awaited weekend. The days may be shorter in winter than summer, but the work week drags along slower in the cold, windy days this time of year. December in central eastern Georgia means rain, and that means mud and muck, which also means slogging through it all day long, unless work gets rained out. The band Guns N' Roses sang that song, Cold November Rain. I honestly don't believe they spent time in a December rain in this region of Georgia. This time of year, the rain comes in freezing cold, heavy drizzles that soak the life out of everything. And following these winter rains is always the same pattern of gusty winds and sub-freezing temperatures. Even this far south, I've personally experienced temperatures as low as 10 degrees Fahrenheit. I daydreamed loosely throughout my remaining time on the clock. Finally, the hour burned out and the tool belts hit the cold gravel, and circular saws and sawhorses made their way to toolboxes, and the extension cords and their air hoses were rolled up and hung inside the trailer. I took a drag from my cigarette and gave my hand motion to my boss back in his truck to the trailer. A little bit to the left. Come on now. All right. Straighten up. Keep her coming. Whoa, that'll do her. I hollered out long enough that folks 3 blocks away could hear me plainly as a ball positioned beneath the hitch. I grabbed the handle to the trailer jack and set the hitch on the ball, kicked the latch home and set the pin, hooked the chains and plugged in the lights. I marched up to the passenger door while taking a long final drag from the Marlboro Red hanging out between my lips. I let the cigarette fall to the gravel before my size 14.5 Justin boot square toe landed on it with a twist, extinguishing the ember and tearing the paper as it was in the ground with the rest of the parking lot. I grasped the door handle to the 2008 Ford F350 Super Duty and wrenched it open briskly before climbing into a wall of warmth pouring from the vents. As my boss put the Ford into gear and set her in motion, he looked at me. "It smelled like a damned ashtray at a dive bar again." "I'm sorry, boss. I was pulling kind of hard on it, trying to finish it up before you left me standing there, looking about like a turkey in a rainstorm," I said, not quite meeting his gaze. My boss, a tall man with a heavy frame topped with salt and pepper hair, had grown up in South Georgia in what's known as the Black Belt, rich, fertile soil that grew in all manner of crops. The man had spent his early years working a tobacco farm and found the stuff downright disgusting. He had stories of cropping it from dawn until dusk, or getting covered in the sticky black tar. He said the stuff got onto every uncovered surface, turning hair into wire, and mixing it with the dust kicked up by the machinery like a glue, leaving everything it covered in a tacky black mess. And plenty of times he commented about how necessity of fair amount of kerosene and scrubbing hard enough to wash the sin of the devil himself. "Are you and your buddy taking that hunting trip you were talking about?" he asked nonchalantly. "Yeah, I've been dying to get out there since he first mentioned it a few weeks ago," I replied. "Well, you head out in them woods smelling like 4 tons of Marlboro ashes and you ain't gonna see a single deer," he chided half-heartedly. "Hell, I ain't worried about that. I shot that doe 2 weeks ago with a lit one in my mouth," I chuckled. "Well, you know they're calling for a frozen mix to be moving in sometime tomorrow after lunch." Shit, I ain't worried about none of that little rain. It never kept me out of the woods before, and it's not like it can snow this time of year. Not around these parts, I reckon. At least I ain't never seen nothing such. I said, somewhat confident my southern accent was getting a little deeper and bolder with a slight agitation. And besides, I got new mud grips on my Nissan and a come-along and a chain if worst comes to worst. Well, y'all can do whatever you want to, but those deers won't be moving around as much if the bad weather's moving in. Maybe y'all ought to wait until next weekend. I've seen deer in the worst we get. I got my eyes set on getting a good-looking buck. He shook his head a little and focused back onto the road. Our idle chatter went on until we pulled into his driveway. He backed the trailer into the parking area that led off the main driveway, and I set to unhooking the trailer while he counted my pay from a wad of hundreds and twenties. He handed me the cash and eyed my truck, a 1991 Nissan pickup Sporting, a beat hard and put away wet look, among the details being 3 different colours of body panels, dents, rust, and a few bullet holes in the bed, mismatched rims and an absent passenger side mirror due to me fumbling the radio and sidesweeping a garbage can. My 2001 Yamaha Bear Tracker 250 4-wheeler was tied in the bed with a ratchet strap, and the passenger seat was loaded with camping gear, while the toolbox was packed tight with hunting equipment. You know, if it does snow, that poor thing won't take you nowhere, he stated. This old truck goes places folks with 4-wheel drive wish their truck could make it, I said, giving the driver's side mud grip a little kick with the toe of my boot. I'll see you Monday, he said, putting his Ford in gear and heading towards his house further down the main driveway. See you Monday, boss, if we ain't snowed in, I said jokingly as I climbed into my own truck and fired the ignition. I let it run for a few minutes, scanning through text messages and social media before pulling her into first gear and heading out towards town. The 4-cylinder with barely a glorified header roared like a pulpwood truck as I got down onto the accelerator, rolling through the 5-speed gear pattern. I took mental note of everything: my tent and sleeping bag, camp stove, cooking utensils, the 40 S&W pistol tucked just behind the gearshift under the lip of the bench seat, the SKS 45 carbine, my 270 Win rifle and 12-gauge shotgun behind the seat, the ammunition, everything accounted for in my mind as I pulled into my town's Walmart. I made my trip within the store a busy subject, starting off in the sporting goods section with several twin packs of 1-pound propane cylinders, some hand warmers, a couple of packs of field dressing gloves. Field dressing gloves are really just cheap vinyl gloves that extend up to the elbow. I made my way over and grabbed up a few packs of sausages, bacon, bologna, and a loaf of bread, a 10-pack of Monster Energy drink, and a 30-pack of Coors Light, and a 24-pack of Coca-Cola, and I was pretty much set, aside from a couple of odds and ends I found on the way to the register, where I bought a carton of cigarettes and a pouch of Redman Green Label chewing tobacco. I was in my truck like my heels were on fire and pulling out of the parking lot of my small-town Walmart as the last rays of winter sun faded from the sky. The trip to my best friend's expensive hunting club would carry me an hour and a half north into the foothills of the mountains. I have been up there several times over the summer, helping with some of the maintenance and building my deer stand. Other than 3 days trip in a bow season and opening weekend of rifle season, I hadn't had much time to really hunt the place, and I was stoked to get up there in the peak of rut season. I pulled up to the gas station to the closest town to the property, still about 30 or so miles away. One of those missed in a blink of an eye kind of towns. I noted the old rusted tin sheets that made up the wall of the arcane building adjacent to the parking lot of the station, while thinking about how this town's heydays were long gone. I knew the little town somewhat, but it had been a railhead town with a booming timber industry and a sawmill, something common across the region of Georgia. Up until the late 80s, maybe the 90s, the timber companies would lease land and pay loggers to go and cut the timber. Things changed and it fell for the loggers to lease the land and cut the timber. A lot of the medium-sized businesses were losing money trying to recoup the lease fees amidst falling timber prices. A lot of good-sized outfits cut losses and sold off equipment. and many small towns in the logging regions saw a major decline in revenue due to the loggers' employees no longer stopping in to purchase from the stores and shops. One by one, the small boondock towns fell to derelict shells of their former glory, with only a few businesses hanging on through the loyal local customers. Loyal in the sense that they couldn't afford to drive 15 minutes or longer just to get a 6-pack of Bud Lights and a pack of smokes. After paying the attendant and filling my tank and pumping 2 5-gallon cans full of gasoline, I departed back onto the highway. 20 minutes later, I took a left off the highway onto a simple 2-lane well beyond the gas station. The pavement was a rough gravel top without much of a distinguishable centre line and a crumbling edges. The tan grass encroaching the edges and a thin layer of leaves and pine straw spoke volumes to the amount of traffic the road had received. I thumbed the switch for the light bar onto my pickup, illuminating everything directly in front as far as the eye could see, with tens of thousands of lumens of cool, bluish white light. I wanted to shoot the deer, not smack them with my truck, I thought, looking at the dense forest to either side of the roadway as I wound my way through its curves and hills at the modest 40 miles per hour. The forest was thick and seemed like an ominous, impenetrable fortress in the all-consuming darkness accentuated with the overcast sky above. After 10 miles passed, I turned right onto the dirt road that led to the property. I slowed down to 20 miles per hour as I banged across the ruts and washboards, the likes of which threatened to rattle both me and my truck to pieces. I just gritted my teeth and dealt with the ride. It definitely wasn't my first rodeo. I was accustomed to dirt and gravel roads and country living in general. This place was out there though, near the definition of isolation. 13 miles of glorified logging trail later, and I could see the bright orange stakes and the reflective bands near the top that marked the entrance to the property. And just as I was about to apply my brakes, a young buck shot out from the tree line and crossed the road just a few yards in front of my bumper. I turned in and passed a red cattle gate that stood open. I drove about half a mile down the path that led to the campsite. I could see the glow of a decent-sized campfire, and the taillights of pickups and the reflective portions of tents were beginning to catch light from the intense beam cast from the roof of my truck. A smile was already tugging at my lips as I pulled up alongside my buddy Derek's dark blue Dodge Ram 1500, and with a green Honda Rancher sitting behind it. There was a trailer with a side-by-side still on it, and Derek's brother Mark had his slate grey Chevy Silverado backed up in such a way that they could toss split firewood straight from the bed onto the fire. And Mark's camper was across from the fire, and there were already 2 tents in front of the trucks in a sort of windbreak circling the wagon's fashion. I hopped out my truck and said my greetings to Derek and Mark. I turned to their cousin Michael and good friend Johnny and his girlfriend Amanda, trading hellos. I dropped my tailgates and drove my 4-wheeler out of the bed, pulling it in a L shape at the back of the trucks. I set my tent facing the fire just in front of my passenger side door and unfolded a pop-up canopy and a folding table right beside the bed. I then set my cooler under the table and a camp stove on the table. Once everything was set and I had my pistol and shotgun placed just inside the tent, I joined the others by the fire with a beer in hand and a Marlboro hanging from my lips. We shared current events and hunting stories around the campfire, over beer with cigarette smoke wafting all around us, mixing with the smoke from the fire in front of us that was beating back the cold winter air. A little after 11 p.m, we called it a night, departing towards our tents. The unofficial lights out signalled by the sound of the camper door and shrieking zippers. I lay there with a million thoughts on my mind and excitement coursing through my veins for what seemed like hours. I started hearing Derek snoring over the night sounds that a short while later I heard a feminine moan and laughed quietly to myself. I could only imagine Johnny and Amanda freezing their asses off in the chill of the night air. I rolled onto my side and eventually allowed sleep to embrace me into an exhausted, dreamless slumber. Sometime later, I woke stiff and feeling half frozen, having rolled out of my sleeping bag and lost my pillow somewhere amongst the tent. I realised I was laying on top of my shotgun, hence the pain in my left shoulder. I stretched and fished my cell phone and cigarettes out of the built-in gear pouch hanging from the side of the tent by the door. Turning the screen on, it read 4:58 a.m. Well, no way I was going back to sleep. I lit a smoke and got into a pair of jeans, pulled on my Carhartt and square-toed boots, and then unzipped the tent and climbed out. The fire had died down to glowing embers with little drops of rain occasionally sizzling on it. I noticed that was the only sound in the forest, and I was suspicious. I knew that a silent forest is a dangerous forest. In hindsight, a group of rowdy campers mixed with the clank of beer bottles and cans and a loud conversation for half the night, not to mention temps in the upper 30s and on and off drizzle for a long while after midnight, likely had all the critters heading for the hills. I shrugged and chucked several pieces of wood onto the coals and stacked them up so that they would shelter the smouldering charcoal from the gentle mist that was falling until the logs could catch. I got out 2 propane lanterns and got them going under my canopy. I broke out the frying pan and fired up my stove. After a little bit I had bacon and sausage frying, a pot of water set to boil, and a cold Coca-Cola in my left hand. As soon as the bacon and sausage were done, I cracked some eggs into the pan and fried them in the grease and dumped some grits in the boiling pot of water. I was sitting down to a hearty breakfast as Derek climbed out of his tent. "Man, you get up way too early," he stated, and then yawned. I motioned to the rest of the food resting in their aluminum foil and paper plate, and Derek didn't even hesitate before tossing several strips of bacon, a couple of sausage patties, and a copious amount of grits and eggs onto the plate, before reaching into his own cooler and retrieving and cracking the top on a cold bottle of Mountain Dew. I placed an old-school army percolator-style coffee pot onto the stove and scooped enough espresso grounds into the basket to wake up a graveyard, and Derek shook his head at the sight. "That thing's older than the dirt on it, man." "Yeah, but it makes a damn fine cup of joe." Soon the scent of coffee permeated the camp and had the rest of our group stirring. 2 more stoves were fired up, and the sizzling of cooking food and conversation mingled with a now crackling fire, whose smoke mixed with the steam of cooking and cigarette smoke and the forest mist as hunting locations were discussed amongst us. Camp was illuminated with lanterns, flashlights, light bars and headlights of both trucks and ATV alike, and a few strands of white Christmas lights strung among the trees, powered by courtesy of Mark's generator. After breakfast, everyone cleaned up and put away utensils and bagged the trash, burning only the paper plates. The property had 4 main trails, stretching through its few thousand-acre expanse, and with the camp located almost centrally in terms of east and west, but barely an eighth of the way in hugging the southern boundary. The trail to the south led to the road. The trail to the north had a few deer stands starting about 200 yards in, a football field-sized target range further on, before leading on to an enormous fish pond in a much larger field, and with a tiny old cabin that belonged to Derek and Mark's grandfather. Johnny and Amanda would be hunting off the north trail, seeing as the closer deer stands were only walking distance from the camp. The eastern trail was around 3 miles long and had several shooting lanes and meadows along its length. At the end, the trail broke into 2-foot trails, leading to 2 very nice tripod stands overlooking a wetland created by runoff from the pond. Although the still hunting sites were nice and the ground blinds were here and there provided excellent cover, Mark had said that the best hunting on that side of the property was on the edge of the wetland. The western trail is where Derek and I would be hunting. It was around 7 miles to its end, and much like the eastern trail, it had plenty of shooting lanes with a couple of ground blinds and ladder stands. The eastern trail ended in a turn around 2 original foot trails and a new one freshly blazed. The new foot trail led to the brand new box stand I built over the summer after paying Derek's grandfather $2,000 for a 5-year lease agreement, which was a great deal to have permission to use this land and hunt with my friends as more than just a random guest. In the lease agreement, I was allowed to claim 8 acres that included a creekside meadow and with a nice thicket to one side and a sheltered bedding area. And with his permission, I hauled in lumber and tools and built a 6-foot by 6-foot box stand on 4-foot legs with stairs leading up to the door on a rise, and the tree line overlooking the meadow. That stand was the pride of my craftsmanship, complete with insulated vinyl siding, premium residential style vinyl windows, an insulated tin roof, carpeted floor, and a very quiet propane heater. Oh, and a solar panel system that powered LED light strips that changed colour with a remote. I primarily used the red or green function because red doesn't interfere with your night vision, and green is almost invisible to game animals. The solar system also had 2 outlets for charging devices and 2 USB ports, one of which had one of those tiny desk fans that circulated the air on the hotter days of bow season and early rifle season. After seeing my little home away from home, half cabin, half deer stand, Derek's grandfather decided that he would rewrite my lease, giving me an additional 2 years for free. The new contract stated that I would receive 7 years of access, provided I left the deer stand on that location permanently, whether I broke my lease or failed to renew it at the end of its term. The contract also stated that for my contribution to the property, my 5-year renewal fee would only cost $1,000 for the first renewal, so long as I adhered to the rules in the contract and renewed the lease on time. I had a permanent pass to access the land as pleased. The rules were simple. Clean up any trash at the camp or hunting and fishing sites. Do not damage trails. Do not hunt in others' locations without permission. Take only mature bucks. Take only 2 does per season. Do not break any wildlife enforcement laws. Follow hunters' safety guidelines. Only hunt during legal hours. And always wear your safety vest outside the camp. Always place your marker on the pegboard, indicating your location. Field dress deer several yards of trails away from stand sites. And never go north into the woods beyond the pond behind the cabin. All of the rules were straightforward and respectful. A responsible hunter would follow them without question. That is, with an exception of the last rule. I figured there was a moonshine still, or maybe a pot grow back there. Honestly, I didn't really care to find out. At around 6 a.m, I made up 4 bologna sandwiches and packed them and a few cokes into my hunting pack. I stepped into my tent and changed into full Realtree camouflage, topped with a regulation blaze orange safety vest. I placed my 40 S&W pistol on my hip and strapped my .270 rifle into the gun rack on the front of my Yamaha. It was misting rain again, and Mark stacked several seasoned logs onto the campfire and a few green logs on top of it to keep burning. I wrapped my rifle with a plastic sheet to keep the weather and any mud splatters away. Johnny and Amanda started off down the north trail on foot with rifles over their shoulders. Mark and Michael climbed into the side-by-side and pulled away as Derek and I began the drive down the western trail. It was still dark, but a combination of headlights and 22-inch light bars peeled the darkness away while illuminating the mist and fog hanging in the air. And we took our time meandering the muddy, rugged trail. I wasn't fully familiar with the trail yet, only having driven it a few dozen times so far, not to mention how trails tend to have variances due to weather when you don't ride them daily. We climbed the steep hills and eased through the valleys between them, crossed a small stream and bumped over rocks on the way down. The total trip took around 45 minutes to reach the turnaround. We went ahead and got the ATVs turned, facing back towards camp and just ahead of the turnaround in case Mark or their grandfather decided to come down the trail. I put on my hunting pack and picked up my rifle, removing the plastic and tucking it into the trunk of my Yamaha. And Derek and I said our farewells and turned our radios to channel 19 so we could contact each other if we needed to. We then started off down our respective footpaths as the first light of dawn struggled through the overcast sky. We would end up about 3/4 of a mile apart. My foot trail would take me about 600 yards away from the turnaround, while Derek's would take him about 400. It was still fairly dark in the pre-dawn light as I carefully traversed the path. The light had greatly increased, but it was still rather dim as I inserted the key in the deadbolt to my stand's door. I fingered the key on the remote glued to the back of the door to turn on the red lights inside, and then went in, setting down my backpack and leaving my rifle in the corner. I went back outside and turned the knobs to the 30-pound propane tank under the stand before returning to light the pilot light on the heater. I preferred my quiet cigarette lighter to the noisy snap and built-in ignition made. I held the pilot knob down, counting to 50 in my head to preheat the system before releasing it. I let the pilot light run another 4 minutes before turning the heating panel on. The flame licked up and down, making a wet flop flop sound a few times before the ceramic element began to light and glow around the edges. I left it on full blast for a little while with the windows open, a little for air circulation. When the stand was at a comfortable 75 degrees and the element glowed bright orange, I turned it to a low setting and shrugged out of my safety vest and heavy jacket. I eased back in my chair and picked up my rifle, chambering 130 grain Winchester, lead point. I removed the cover from the scope. I placed my rifle back into the corner and lounged for a while with the window open a crack. I had a little digital weather station that told me time, date, inside and outside temperatures, humidity and the moon phase. The time read 7:50 a.m. The date was Saturday, December 13th, and it was 36 degrees outside. The humidity was 97% and the moon was full. I daydreamed as I stared out over the meadow below me. Birdsongs and wilderness sounds, and despite the weather, carried over the soft whisper of the heater. I felt in tune with nature. I thought about the little two-room cabin Derek and I were planning to build, with an awning on the back to store our four-wheelers later in the spring. The thought of a fireplace and real beds and a solar-powered miniature home made the thought of spending more time out here that much more appealing. It would be nice to have a shallow well and a hot water heater for a stall shower, not to mention a secure place to store our hunting gear instead of carrying it back and forth. Nothing too fancy, just something better than tents and sleeping on the ground. Time passed as I ran through 1,000 thoughts in my head. Glancing at the clock, it was 1:15 p.m. I opened the foil on my sandwiches and ate them while drinking one of the Cokes. Shortly after, nature called, and so I put on my coat and vest and quietly made my way a couple of 100 feet back up the trail to relieve myself. I heard a faint gunshot from far to my east. Mark or Michael must have killed a deer, I thought. I made my way back to my stand. At 2:40, I noted the temperature was now 30 degrees and the light drizzle was still unending. I went back to staring out the window, thinking that it might actually change to snow. Out here, in this isolated area, my cell phone had no service, and so checking the weather app was out of the question. Hell, back in the little town, I only had a single bar of 1X signal. Movement then caught my eye. I was a doe. Wait, 2, no 3 does, and they was cautiously making their way onto the meadow on the other side of the creek. One stopped at the mineral site and started pawing the ground before lowering her head to the dirt. The mineral site had been a sweet gum tree that I cut down and sawed the stump to 6 inches tall before laying a 50-pound brown mineral salt block on the stump and leaving it there for several months. I removed the block and embedded large Himalayan salt rocks into the soil around it. Once the deer took stock to the site and began tearing up the earth and chewing the stump, I started lacing the ground with gallon jugs of liquid mineral concentrate every so often. The other 2 does moved around on towards the food plot I'd purposely planted. They lowered their heads and began grazing at the clovers and other greens. I watched them for over an hour, hoping on hope that a buck would come along. And suddenly all 3 deer stopped and lifted their heads with ears lifted and trained on the thicket. The anticipation of what was there coursed through my veins, feeding the beast within me and spiking my adrenaline. I took a calming breath to settle myself and then allowed the predatory animal instincts to take over my senses. A young 6-point buck stepped into the clearing and with a greeting grunt and carefully moved towards the smaller of the 3 does. He was overly observant of his surroundings and took his time to get comfortable. He began his tending grunt as he smelled the doe's sex. She kept moving, and he would bawl and grunt each time. It was a courting ritual I'd seen only once before. For each grunt, she'd give a snort bleat, as would the others. Well, this went on for another 10 minutes, and just as the doe was near surrender, all 4 deer froze, ears up, eyes staring to my right. From the trees came a deep grunt, a challenging grunt as a very large buck came onto the meadow. The younger buck gave a grunt back defiantly. The larger buck charged straight up to him and stopped a few feet short, dominantly raising his head. 10 menacingly large points rose from his rack. His antlers were impressive. The hunter in me was already lining up a shot, but the predator in me wanted to watch something I had never seen. The does then retreated to the thicket as antlers began crashing upon antlers. Hooves flew like prize fighters sparring as this epic battle ensued. Well, the fight only lasted a minute or two as I stared on in amazement through my scope. The younger buck was overcome and quickly retreated. The large old trophy buck stood proud and then looked directly into my scope as the apex predator within me gently exhaled as I squeezed the trigger as fluid and softly as caressing a familiar love. The explosion from the muzzle of my rifle was deafening, and the entire forest fell absolutely silent as quickly as the old buck took a single step and then collapsed. The life already draining from his eyes as he hit the dirt. I checked the time and it was 3:54 p.m. I made my way from my stand to the buck. I pulled a strap from my pack and dragged him to my stand. I collected my rifle in the trash and then shut off the heater and the gas before locking the door. With my rifle over my shoulder, I dragged the buck halfway up the trail. I pulled him a fair distance away from the path next to a depression I'd already dug months ago. I started a process of field dressing. Letter from the United States Department of Defense, Civilian Resource Department. August 3rd, 1967. From Widmore Gary M., Director of DoD CRD, to a Mr. Henry B. Culver. Mr. Culver, this statement is the final confirmation and congratulation of your recent purchase of approximately 37,000 acres of property formerly owned by the United States Department of Defense Research Division. I proudly name you sole owner of this land parcel and thank you for your previous military service. I would like to reiterate the terms of the contract declared with your purchase. Under no circumstances should the gated 4 acres to the northeast of the centre of the property, located beyond the large pond, be entered or otherwise disturbed for any reason. The contents of this area are classified under further notice. Contents of this location are not in any way a threat to the land nor inhabitants of said land. This site is not biologically threatening or radioactive. This area is the remnants of research activities conducted in the surrounding areas. Also adjacent to the 4-acre gated area, there is a large concrete slab. As per the contract, this slab is to remain in place undamaged and shall not be removed under any circumstance. Failure to comply with these terms will result in seizure of this parcel and a Class 1 capital offence applied to all inhabitants and participants. Thank you again for your purchase. If you wish to purchase adjacent parcels, please contact our Realty Department. Sincerely, Gary M. Whitmore. It was nearly dark when I finally finished dragging my buck back to my 4-wheeler. It certainly was a task. Derek hadn't made it back yet, so I keyed the mic on my radio. "Hey brother, you about ready to get a move on?" A moment later he responded, "Yeah man, almost there." "Alright, I'll wait for you then, buddy." I looked around in the drizzle as I waited for my friend. Glancing at my 4-wheeler, I noticed ice accumulating on the steel tracks. I flipped on my flashlight and inspected a thin layer of otherworldly material. And then I looked at the low-hanging pine branches beside me. The needles all glistened with a fine coating of ice. I keyed my mic again. "Hey man, I think we need to go ahead and get a move on. It's starting to ice out here." "Shit, I'll be there in 5 minutes, man. Go ahead and put out if you want." Nah, man, I'll wait. A few minutes later, Derek jogged out of the foot trail and we mounted the four-wheelers with urgency. We had never seen this kind of weather this early in the year, but it still didn't mean there wouldn't be trouble coming from it. Ice storms are destructive, and the last thing we needed to do was get stranded out here. And just a few hours of freezing rain would have branches and trees weighed down heavily. And then, if the wind picked up, the landscape would look like a war zone. Trees would fall and the roads would be impassable. The focus would be on clearing roads and restoring electricity to towns long before road crews came out this far. Derek was speeding through the trail and I was pushing my Yamaha hard to keep up with him. I think he was panicking, and this wasn't the best time to panic. We had time to break camp and get out of here before the situation turned bad. I was just about to flash my light at him to slow down when it happened. And Derek started down a steep incline. His front tyre caught into a deep rut and the front of his Honda veered hard left, slamming into an oak tree. Derek and the four-wheeler both went tumbling and rolling the rest of the way down the hill. I quickly but carefully descended the slope and jumped off my machine and hurried over to him. Derek's 5'11" frame looked beat pretty good. The Honda was trashed. I flipped it back over, seeing the handlebars were badly bent. The fuel tank was punctured and empty, and the front right tyre was off the beat. I assumed that was the part that struck the tree, and Derek let out a groan as I pulled him to his feet, bloody mouth and nose, holding his torso. He didn't appear to have any broken arms or legs, but I wasn't sure about his ribs. There was a nasty knot forming on the back of his head, and he was disorientated. I put him on the back of my four-wheeler, straddling the seat, laying against the back of the big buck tied across the rack. I retrieved his rifle, which looked mostly intact, and just then I heard 4 gunshots in the direction of camp. Something was off about that, but whatever was going on, they could handle it. I drove on down the trail, slower than coming in this morning. The trail was slippery with mud, and the hills were the biggest challenge. I'm not sure how long it took to get back to camp, but the sight I pulled up onto was one I'll never forget. Johnny was on the hood of Mark's truck, tearing at the windshield with bloody hands. A deep, animalistic scream that nearly drowned out Amanda's screams from within the truck, ripping from his throat like the wail of a blast siren. Without thinking, I rushed him and snatched him off the hood. "What the actual fuck?" I said as we fell to the muddy ground and I caught sight of his eyes. Piercing, blue light emanated from the irises, as if they were LED lights made into them. As soon as we hit the dirt, he was on me like a rabid hound, groping and gouging at my face and trying to bite me. His mouth was full of what looked like bloom corn syrup that dripped onto my face and clothes as he continued his assault. My lightning-fast reflexes had enacted as the beast within me surged with adrenaline. I had him by the throat with my left hand and my right fist slammed into his forehead repeatedly until a dent started forming. Johnny was a big guy, around 6 foot tall and weighed nearly 350. He was dead weight on top of my 6'7" frame, and all 270 pounds of me was fighting to get from under his weight, while continuing to pound his skull over and over. I was losing this battle and control. "No, not now. Keep it together, Tyler. You can't lose control. Not here, not in front of the people. Hold it together. Stay calm. Stay in control. Don't give in," I thought to myself. In one of the last moments of controlled thought, I remembered my pistol on my hip. I dug my throbbing right hand under my hip and drew the Smith & Wesson. I put the barrel between Johnny's gnashing teeth and he bit down hard enough to leave slight indentations on the polymer that made up the lower frame. The front sight on the slide broke his 2 front teeth as the first 4 .40 caliber hollow points tore massive paths through the roof of his mouth and rear upper skull plate. His body went slack as the blue light drained from his eyes, and black, ichor-like blood flowed onto me like molasses as I rolled his body off of me. Amanda was shaking like a tin roof in a twister as she told me how Johnny had set her up at the first stand side and presumably moved on to one further down the trail. She told me that he'd come running back white as a ghost, sputtering nonsense about how we all had to leave just before dark. She said they made it to the campsite and they were breaking camp as he rattled on about the cemetery behind the pond. The blue eyes, the blue eyes. He kept rattling on about blue eyes. She told me they were waiting for us because the keys, they weren't in ignition, and when the two spectres came. And they had blue glowing eyes like Johnny, and they came from the North Trail. And Johnny managed to put one down with his rifle, but the second one got to him and got him on the ground. Amanda had hit it with a splitting maul and recovered Johnny's rifle, managing to shoot it in the head as it was trying to get up after the splitting maul had decimated half of its face. She said the first one had tried to get back up after being shot, and so she shot it again, and this time in the head instead of center mass. After several minutes, Johnny started vomiting and then fell and started twitching and writhing around and then stood, and his eyes slowly began to glow. Amanda said he rushed her and pinning her to the ground, but she was able to get up and get away, and she ran and locked herself in Mark's truck, and that was when, just before, we pulled up. The hairs on my arms were standing up as she divulged this to me. I looked at Derek and then to her. I told her he'd rolled his four-wheeler and needed to get to hospital. I told her to drive Derek's truck, taking the keys from his belt and placing them in her hand. I told her to drive as quickly as she could without crashing to the service station back in town. Call the police and get Derek an ambulance, and tell the police a group of men were here at the camp with guns. Tell them anything that will make them come here in force. I said all of this as I helped a semi-lucid Derek into the passenger seat of his truck while watching blue lights moving closer from both the Northern Trail and the Western Trail I just come from. I told her I had to find and help Mark and Michael as 3 shots rang out in the distance from the direction of the Eastern Trail. Amanda watched Tyler place his hunting rifle behind the seat of his pickup, pulling out an assault-type weapon and 3 big magazines. He strapped it over his shoulder on a sling, letting it fall to the right of his torso. He put a pump shotgun on his four-wheeler's gun rack and took off down the Western Trail as she pulled out onto the Southern Trails. She watched a blue pair of lights moving closer to the camp in the rear-view mirror, and she looked at Derek, and he looked rough. A million thoughts raced through her mind as a thin layer of ice on the body of the truck grew thicker. The full impact of Johnny's death hadn't struck yet, and she was nearly to the highway, about to turn off the battered 2-lane, when a bite mark on her left breast started to burn like fire. She hadn't been able to hold him back, she thought, and she was in the midst of changing her clothes when the attack happened. She had just stood there in shock, cold and topless, next to the fire, when Johnny fell. And she had rushed to him, and he had opened those luminescent blue eyes and then drug her to the dirt. His mouth found perches on her left breast, and his teeth had penetrated her skin. He barely had her with only one arm, and so she put her feet against his stomach and wrenched herself away from his grip. She ran topless and screaming to Mark's truck, where she found her other jacket and got it on after locking the doors. Amanda stopped the truck 50 feet from the intersection, and she pulled off the jacket, exposing herself. And with her foot on the brake and the truck in gear, she examined the bite on her breast. And Derek was out of it, so she didn't feel modesty was an issue. She reached for her backpack to the rear floorboard. After looking over the bruised, inflamed-looking bite mark, as her hands gripped the bag, her body then convulsed. Her foot came off the brake and the truck moved forward slowly as the half-nude woman spasmed in the glow of the dome light. Derek was slumped in the seat, totally unaware that his life was in mortal danger. The hematoma growing inside his skull was likely going to cut his life short in a few days as it was, without emergency surgery. Timothy Morrison was a long-haul trucker, returning from a 3-day haul to upstate New York. He was hoping to make it home to his young wife and newborn daughter before the ice storm got fully underway. He saved enough money to make it through the rest of the winter and planned to start a landscaping business near the beginning of spring, leaving the trucker's life behind him. He was 40 miles from home when Amanda's spasm sent her foot crashing down onto the accelerator, and the blue Dodge fired out from the intersection with its V8 Hemi engine roaring. Tim Morrison, he never had a chance to move his foot to the brake pedal as the front of his dad's bobtailing Peterbilt contacted the passenger side door of the Dodge Ram at 50 miles per hour. Tim only felt the truck hit and then slide towards the ditch before rolling and coming to a rest against the trees. He managed to get out of the wrecked tractor before collapsing back against it and falling to a sitting position. Hot blood steamed as it poured from the side of his head. He was thinking how disappointed his father must be looking down from above at the smoking wreck of his most prized possession, and how it had become at the hands of a son he had left it to, when he'd had a heart attack and fell face first into a bowl of grits and eggs 2 years ago at the local Waffle House. And then Tim saw her. Illuminated by the one remaining headlight of his dad's tractor was a once gorgeous redhead, and she was shambling towards him, a broken bone protruding from her left shin, her left arm shattered and bloody. She was topless, her once perfect breast marred with a deep bite mark and splattered with blood from the crash. As she approached him, eyes glowing blue in the dark of the night, ice-cold rain fell freezing on contact of every cold surface. And Tim felt the half-nude woman's grab on the back of his neck, and he was gasping for air as his lungs filled with his own life's blood. And he thought the woman was moving to kiss him, but instead felt the beautiful woman's teeth sink into his windpipe. He felt her consuming his flesh up until the moment when her clawed hand punctured his abdomen and reached up under his ribcage to grasp his heart. His vision was going black as the last sight he'd ever see played before him. This beautiful blood-soaked, half-nude woman pressed his heart to her mouth and began devouring it in front of him. The last trace of life left Tim Morrison as his body spasmed with the last synapses in his brains firing. The Nightmare of Winter. Part 2. Let's get straight into that. Letter from General Franklin D. Abrams to United States Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. Wednesday, February 19th, 1941. Warning. Highly classified information. Mr. Secretary, I would like to update you on Project Nebula. Location, rural, redacted county, near redacted Georgia. Project Nebula, as you know, is our effort to contribute to our allies engaged in a great war. Serum XV999-CFD4 shows highest potential for congruent healing capabilities throughout all current subjects. Wounded subjects heal within minutes. This serum has the capability to become a key factor in aiding our allies. There have, however, some side effects present throughout our extensive testing. All 100 current subjects have undergone extensive muscle growth and have lost all sense of self-preservation. Lead physician Melanio believes this is due to the use of proteins and RNA from the rabies virus that were used to stabilize the serum's interaction with the brain and frontal cortex. Another side effect is, while dramatic and unsettling, less worrisome, DNA taken from oceanic algae cultures have caused bioluminescent glowing in the eyes. Further testing is necessary before field trials are warranted. Requesting 30 days further from original deadline. Sincerely, Frank D. Abrams. Tyler Hillmark watched as Amanda put the Dodge into drive and began driving down the south trail towards the dirt road. He prayed to himself silently as he kicked the Yamaha into gear that she would have the cavalry head in this direction soon. This nightmare had become a horrific ordeal, and he knew well that whatever hellish monstrosity had turned Johnny into that abomination he just emptied bullets into could be nothing of this natural earth. What he couldn't have known is that the rifle report from earlier hadn't been Mark nor Michael killing a deer. It had been Johnny's 7mm Magnum put in hot steel through a lock-on 10-foot tall wrought iron fence containing secrets from over half a century before. Dark secrets the government or the United States would prefer to keep buried in suspended animation for the rest of eternity. An evil that modern weapons could only subdue for the limited amount of time while the regeneration process took place. Tyler nor any of his friends could have fathomed the unimaginable level of evil that lay buried and near forgotten in that isolated 4-acre patch of wilderness. Likely it would have remained hidden for centuries further, warded in place by the confines of those cold moss and algae-ridden grey bars of iron. Johnny disturbed the one final failsafe ingrained within the things that lie dormant for so many years. The natural resonance of the earth amplified by the iron bars caused the mutated serum to become inactive and allowed the host to rot as though they were any corpse. Once the gate swung free, this frequency was disrupted and the ward broken. Johnny walked upon the hallowed ground as glowing blue eyes opened and bodies of so many test subjects and contaminated personnel began to reanimate. He walked through the heart of the rows of mass graves of half-decayed hands clawed at the earth from below. Once the first hand broke free into the icy mist and rain above it, I was too late to reverse this foul action. By the time Johnny saw the first pair of menacing blue eyes illuminating the late afternoon fog and mist, the fates of he and his friends and so many others were forever changed. I barreled down the eastern trail at a brisk pace. I noticed the blue glowing orbs behind me as they began pouring into the camp as it disappeared from view. I noticed them here and there along the trail, and they were terrifying beacons of receding hope. It took all 20 minutes to arrive to the bloodbath that lay midway to the end of the eastern trail. Mark's Polaris Ranger was ploughed into a thicket of small pines. Michael was in pieces, being devoured by the unholy abominations as they turned their cold, dead eyes to the bright beam of light pouring from the front of my four-wheeler. Mark was further away, back in the opposite direction, and two of the bastards were tearing his intestines from his abdomen as he was rasping for breath and escaped his eviscerated throat in an attempt to scream. I dismounted in a feral rage, unleashing a howlstorm of 7.62 full metal jackets. I timed my discharges, breathing steady, aiming for the head. I had all but 3 of the things down when I stopped to swap to a fresh 30-round magazine. I ejected the spent magazine and was jamming a fresh one into the magwell as one of them hit me from behind. My predatory senses felt the blow coming, and my inhuman reflexes allowed me to compensate for the follow-through. Using the momentum of the attack to spin, bringing the barrel of the weapon into my attacker's eye, I released the bolt and pulled the trigger, sending a black spray of blood and brain matter. 2 bullets, one of which found the chest of one of the other monstrosities behind the first attacker. The second, finding its head, blew the barrel of my carbine from the creep's eye socket. I downed 2 more that were approaching from behind before spinning and dealing hot lead into the skulls of the remaining 3 I was originally engaging. I stopped to breathe, the gravity and anger swirling through my body like a nuclear-driven hurricane at the sight of my dismantled friends laying on the ground. Mark had succumbed to the mortal injuries he had sustained. Many things streamed through my mind. My vision blurred and my body shook. I was furious. My soul was shattering. My self-inflicted mental torment vanished as I heard the sound of heavy crashing footfalls. My shoulders dropped. I dodged behind the nearest tree, taking cover as two giant blue headlights, over the eyes of this massive being, appeared 30 feet above in the trees. What the fuck is this Resident Evil-ass motherfucker? I thought as the lumbering behemoth came into full view, smashing through trees like a bulldozer. I opened fire, directly attacking the face of the beast. My rounds were like flies as it slowly ambled towards my position. The last round in my magazine contacted its enormous left eye, and it bellowed an earth-trembling roar of pain. It reached down and grabbed my four-wheeler as though it was a child's toy and hurled it in my direction. I rolled out of the way, drawing from my pistol and unleashing the 10 remaining rounds, taking careful aim for the Leviathan's eyes. And the great monster was closing the distance as my slide locked back. I dropped the pistol next to my carbine as I removed my boots. The fury swelled through me as I surrendered to the beast within. Black flames engulfed my body as fur poured from my flesh. My arms and legs grew long, my muscles and bones contorting. My jaw then elongated into a muzzle as my vision and my hearing went razor sharp. I grinned a wicked, predatory smile onto my unnaturally large wolf lips. I was 12 foot at the shoulder now that I had shed my human-like form. My howl tore forth like the sound of a twister in the bowels of hell as the last of the black flames dissipated from my body. My glowing red eyes locked with those of the Titan before me. The confusion it displayed as it froze in curiosity of what it beheld in front of it was painted in a look of sheer shock across its rotten features. I gave no time nor quarter as I leapt forth, sinking my 10-inch fangs into the monster's throat, my breath like hot diesel exhaust as I rapidly shook my jowls like a pit bull with a new toy. The titan of a monster flowered, attempting to seek reprieve from the onslaught of my vicious assault. It bellowed through a torn jugular as it fell to the cold, icy ground. My jaws lashed repeatedly at the creature's throat and neck, and my horrible black claws tore into its eyes and nose as I found purchase to tear chunks of flesh from its neck and shoulders. My fangs punctured its scalp and plunged into its skull as I jerked and wrestled it, dragging it with me. A great sickening wet ripping sound filled the wilderness as its shoulders caught between two pines and its head, and a large portion of its spine tore free from its body. The black fire that poured from my lungs with each breath ignited the vast corpse of the rotten monstrosity. The beast was in control. Bloodlust screamed through my veins as I tore forth to unleash my deadly, supernatural wrath unto these undead abominations. The journey was short-lived as I came upon a murderous group of fiendish vile things. Blue eyes were extinguished as my massive fangs tore through bone and rotten flesh. My massive paws swiped left and right, ramming 7 6-inch claws, desecrating the bodies before me as I took 2 legs. I tore an unholy warpath before me, fueled by anger, hatred, like unleashing hell fire. As I fought my way like a force of unbridled nature back into camp, I saw Johnny standing amongst the others as they rushed towards me. His blue eyes shone brighter than ever as my claws and my teeth tore his disfigured body to shreds. I stood panting, my breath blasting flames as I recovered my great wolfish form. And looking back up into the eastern trail, the rest I had previously killed, including a half-burned behemoth, were pouring at me like a river. I took back to 2 legs. I seized my pickup in a large paw and hurled the vehicle like a bullet passed straight into the big son of a bitch as it closed to around 100 yards or so. The titanic monster was blown off its feet, falling onto and crushing several of the smaller other ones as it slid backwards. The poor truck ricocheted off, continuing to fly a short distance before crashing into a few more of the things. Good luck explaining this to my insurance agent, I thought. I tore a medium-sized oak tree from the centre of camp, and biting the trunk in half, I grasped the lower portion around 10 feet long. I took the log against the horde like a Louisville slugger, bashing them as though I was nailing them into the earth. I speared the big one through the chest as it rose, resorting back to claws and fangs as it took the never-ending onslaught like a demonic hurricane. As fast as I could rip them to shreds, they seemed to reanimate and regenerate back into their disfigured, unnatural forms. I was surrounded as whatever evil force driving them grew stronger and faster. I was in a press of rotting corpses, with fiendish hands groping me and gnashing teeth tearing into my fur. I let out howls of fury as I bit and smashed and clawed everything in sight. My frustration fueled the apex predator as an unstoppable force crashed against unyielding objects. The Titan then smashed into me as we rolled and crushed bodies beneath us. My teeth and claws tore at him as he closed his jaws repeatedly into me, and his giant fists assaulted my snout and chest. And we rolled and crashed through the forest like some great wrestling match. I tore away from it, and then took back to 2 legs as we grappled again. I tore my claws into its face, I sunk fangs into every conceivable place. My legs buckled as my massive form tripped over fallen trees. The ground rattled as my gargantuan body fell to meet the cold, icy forest floor. The behemoth was upon me, and I felt the life being crushed from my lungs as its huge jaws closed around my throat. The others were on me as well, tearing and biting. My bright red glowing eyes were going dim, and the world was fading. No! I screamed in my head as another level of preternatural fury tore through my body. The adrenaline flushed through my massive werewolf veins as all of my muscles strained. Black flames poured from my claws and mouth as I shoved my paws into the giant's mouth. I tore his head entirely in half before I grasped at a deep breath. I took to his body like a turbocharged steel shredder, and I tore every piece of him to tiny bits. I broke every bone in my teeth. I tore every chunk of flesh to ribbons. I was absolutely done with this bullshit. I was upon the horde, ripping everything, whether abomination or tree or vehicle, to pieces. The beast was in control. This was the level that lay beyond beast mode. I crushed bone and tissue into nothing. As quickly as they could get up, I was on them like flies on dung. This game was becoming old, and the ice was growing thick. Freezing rain turned to sleet as I finally decided to leave. The big one hadn't regenerated and lay cold and silent in millions of tiny pieces. I then scooped my duffel bag into my teeth and stormed through the wilderness in the direction of civilization. I couldn't fight these things all night. I would burn out all of my energy. I would already be weak and worn out when I retook my human form. Everything I cared about was either dead or mangled behind me. There was no point in indulging the fruitless bloodbath any longer. Those things were hard to kill and even seemed to multiply at some rate when torn in half. Screw that. The police or military or somebody other than myself could deal with that roadside freak show from hell. Officer Ryan Kelly of the Georgia State Patrol was making his rounds through the long stretches of rural highway. He knew well that folks in these parts often enjoyed exceeding the speed limit and often had a few too many drinks. He had seen enough horrible wildlife crashes and DUI-induced wrecks on these country roads. People treated these sparsely populated highways like they were the autobahn. They only slowed down when approaching a town, and then soon as they cleared the town limit, they were back to doing 90 and a 55. It was nearly midnight, and freezing rain had fallen in a steady hard drizzle for more than 6 hours, before gradually transitioning to sleet that now pelted his windshield like furious little cannonballs as he drove along somewhere between 40 and 50 miles an hour. He was driving alert and careful, knowing the dangers of the black ice and accumulated sleet over the partially ice-coated asphalt. He slowed for a frozen bridge as he noticed an odd sight ahead. A dim light shone through the darkness and blurring sleet-filled air. As he approached, he called in for assistance from the nearby town, noting a semi that was overturned and after T-boning a pickup truck. He felt it was odd as he put on his flashing blue lights. There wasn't a crossing intersection here. Yet, that truck looked as though it meant to drive directly across the highway. He figured that the truck had been travelling over speed and skidded past the stop sign. Ryan exited his patrol car to survey the scene. The beam of his Streamlight tactical flashlight illuminated the crash through the spitting of sleet. He noticed flakes of snow mingling with the tiny hail-like balls of ice. He first approached a big black Peterbilt laying on its side in the ditch. The driver's seatbelt was locked in the used position but opened, hanging askew. The open door indicated that the driver had climbed out. Ryan yelled for the driver, but there was no answer. He made his way to the blue Dodge Ram pickup, still sitting in the middle of the highway, and the passenger side mangled heavily. Ryan keyed his mic, reporting one deceased passenger and 2 missing drivers as the headlights, accompanied by blue flashing police strobes, topped the hill in the direction of the town. Ryan scratched his head, wondering where the drivers had gone. It seemed to him that they would have sustained injuries, and if they had taken to town on foot, well, surely they would have flagged down the local sheriff cars that were now slowing to approach him, as he noted the red lights of an ambulance and the headlights of volunteer first responder vehicles. Peggy Hurst was a widowed wife of a timber mill foreman. Her husband, Bill Hurst, had passed 5 years ago at the age of 79. She had found difficulty sleeping in these last years due to her grief, but also contributed by her 19-year-old granddaughter, Stephanie. Stephanie was often out late and preferred staying up all night and sleeping most of the day. She wasn't a bad child, but she could use some morals. Peggy had seen flashing lights of the police and ambulance pass her second-story window. Her and her late husband's home was a modest 2-story, 4-bedroom, colonial-style house that stood around 100 feet from the main highway on 8 acres of land. The land had a decent-sized field to the south and the woodland to the north. The property was just a few miles from the small town that was the county seat. Well, there wasn't much to do in the town these days, not like when the timber industry had been thriving. There was a gas station, general store, a cafe, and a couple of little shops in town. Overall, things were quaint and quiet, as one would expect a tiny map dot like this old forgotten railhead. Well, that is an exception of the 20 or so cars that passed on the highway every couple of hours and the pack of ravenous raccoons that continually raided her garbage cans at night. Peggy heard faint crashing sounds outside. Letting out a sigh, she pulled on a heavy house robe over her nightgown and picked up her husband's .357 Magnum revolver, loaded with shot shells. The rat shot wouldn't kill the varmints necessarily, but it would send them running for the night. And she held the pistol in her right hand, finger away from the trigger, as she moved through the house. And there was another sound leading from the front of her home. It didn't make sense to her, as her trash cans were behind the house. Her ancient left hand trembled slightly as she opened the locks on the front door. She let the door swing open as she fumbled for the light switch. The porch light illuminated the mist and sleet-laden air as a few snowflakes fluttered to the cold earth below. And at first, Peggy's old eyes saw very little out of place, until they landed on the man moving towards her from the side of her home. She raised her gun at him and spoke up. Who are you, and what business do you have on my land, child?" And there was no reply as ice formed in her old veins. And that's when she noticed the second one. A topless woman nearly to her, The strangeness of the sight made her suspicious. She leveled a revolver and fired into the woman's chest. The number 9 shot pellet struck the woman true, but she made no sound. The old woman let out a feral scream that echoed off the ice-laden trees bordering the yard as she launched herself from the porch with inhuman speed and slamming her fangs into the throat of the woman embracing the topless thing with bone-crunching force before reeling and shoving the glowing blue-eyed thing away from her. She retched at the taste of foul blood that filled her mouth. While Stephanie, hearing her grandmother's feral shriek after the gunshot, burst from her Netflix show and sprinted to the window. She launched herself through the glass, landing on the man, sinking her own fangs into his throat. Black, rotten blood filled her mouth as she threw the man across the yard as if he was a football. She looked at her grandmother, who nodded, and Stephanie set upon the creatures with inhuman strength, ripping their heads from the shoulders and tearing their bodies limb from limb, as her grandmother held them in place, her grip like an iron vice. These things were evil, unnatural, and they were abominations that shouldn't exist. And both women knew these facts as soon as that decayed blood had reached their mouths. The 2 vampires could not believe their eyes as the 2 corpses began to stand again. No longer were they ripped apart, they were remade as they were before, now almost fully nude. The women looked at each other. Fear wasn't typically in their nature, and both women backed into the house, firmly bolting the door behind them as Peggy retched again. The bite on her arm from the struggle beginning to burn like hellfire. It was mid-morning as Veronica Lewis sat up in her bed. She ran a hand through her shoulder-length black hair before rousing her passed-out lover from the night before. She informed him that his business trip was over as he climbed from her bed. Within minutes, he was heading back to his lovely young wife, and she was making her way to the shower. And she was a real estate agent and did whatever it took to seal the deal, often sleeping with married men to ensure they couldn't back out on deals that provided her with commission. She hadn't had to report back to a man's wife or ruin any families so far through her 3 years of selling homes and entertaining unsure buyers. And she was 28 with a head-turning, voluptuous body. She looked like the big city had come to a podunk town, but in earnest she had picked up her modest abode for next to nothing and enjoyed a peaceful, rural setting. She exited the shower before toweling off and dressing in a simple t-shirt and blue jeans. She slid into a pair of cozy pink slippers with little black Playboy bunnies on the toe before making her way to the kitchen. She was pouring orange juice as wind gusted, and she heard the splintering destruction of a tree bursting as with the power cut. And she drew the curtains and looked out the big bay window of her kitchen at the icy winter mess strewn across her yard. The wind was now gusting, and still falling sleet was pounding against her window. The wind-driven fog and sleet falling in sheets made it look like a blizzard outside of her window. She opened her refrigerator, looking at the expired pack of lunch meat and about a cup's worth of 2% milk as she replaced a carton of orange juice. And she peered into her cabinets, only finding a couple of bags of rice and a few canned vegetables. And Veronica decided that she'd try to get to the general store before the entire town lost power. She wasn't even sure if she had a flashlight, and she got her wallets and keys, pulled on her black North Face jacket, and climbed into a brand new Chevrolet Tahoe. She failed to notice the dozens of bodies obscured in the fog moving towards her home as she pulled onto the highway carefully, avoiding a fallen tree as she heard the loud cracking of a limb breaking just off the road. The town limit was only 2 miles away from her home, and she smiled a few minutes after crossing the boundary as she saw the lights on Marty's general store and hardware. And she made her way through the empty aisles as old Marty watched her in the mirrors mounted along the ceiling. She decided to purchase a camping stove and several bottles of propane. She figured she could at least have hot food and keep warm while cooking. She selected several groceries and lots of granola bars and junk food. She walked her little cart over to the counter, where the old man eyed her warmly as he rung up her items. It had been a while since Marty had sold more than $30 worth of goods at once, and he felt grateful for the young woman's patronage. Not to mention, she was easy on the eyes, especially his old sunken, wrinkled eyes. He had been wary of the young woman only seeing her in his store a few times, buying things like duct tape and a hammer, occasionally some junk food or cans of soda. She was an outsider. He knew she was relatively new in town, but judging by the groceries and carefully manicured hand resting on the counter, she had more than a few dollars to her name. He punched in the last price label and keyed the tax and total buttons on his old register as she moved to the debit card reader as the power went out. He cussed under his breath as he went about to offer the young woman a line of credit in lieu of the dismal outdoor conditions when she retrieved cash from her wallet. Veronica was handing Marty the outstretched bills, and just before they could brush his calloused hand, she heard him mutter, "What the hell?" And she turned as he produced his daddy's old sawn-off double-barrel 12-gauge from under the register. She gasped and dropped the bills as both barrels fired at once, shoving the old man's wrist skyward. She stood in horror as one nude man crumpled to the floor in a spray of blood, as others, in various states of dress and decomposition, rushed into the store. Veronica and Marty had little hope as the woman was dragged to the floor in a wave of teeth and hands closing around her body. She felt her clothes tear, teeth sinking into her bare flesh, as she was too terrified to even scream as she was being eaten alive. The shopkeeper tried to run towards the back room where he kept spare shells for the shotgun, but let out a deep scream of pain as hands seized his arm and teeth followed ripping his flesh. And within seconds there were more than the old man could count on him. He yelled and punched, but it was all in vain. His old heart gave out as he swung his wrinkled fist one last time, connecting with the skull of a nude woman. The Marine Corps graduation ring cracking the red-headed abomination's skull as his body went limp. Marty's eyes twitched as the woman lowered her mouth to his face, ripping at the flesh on his forehead. The Nightmare of Winter. Part 3. Let's get straight into that. Tyler Hillmark sat on his haunches, panting in his wolfen form, the blood of the doe freshly glistening across his enormous muzzle. He had to eat consistently large meals every few hours while transformed to maintain his strength and speed. Eating would also lessen the effects once he retook his human form. Tyler didn't care much for the crash that would occur if he allowed himself to become malnourished. He thought to himself about how he'd brought his assault weapon in case of bears. A smile tugged at his lips. Unannounced to him, it was almost comical in nature. Here sat a massive wolf having just devoured an entire adult deer. Bones, hooves, hair and all. Smiling like a lunatic thinking about needing an assault weapon. And there was no bear on this planet that could hope to hold a candle to his massive form. He finished his comedic internal musings and licked the blood from his jowls. He turned his mouth towards the gloomy morning sky and let forth a howl that caused the ice-laden trees to shiver as it boomed for miles across the landscape. Before the echo could end, he was gone, his titanic form silently dissipating through the trees and brush. His powerful legs carried him forth, his huge paws digging deeply into the earth. He would remain transformed until he found a way to end this nightmare, if he could end it. Stephanie climbed the stairs to her room. Her clothes were soaked in the putrid blood of those abominations. Her bedroom had a small bathroom with a stall shower, a sink, a mirror, and a commode. She stripped off her fouled clothes and put them in a plastic bag. She reached to the shower knobs and turned them so that the water fell from the shower head in a steaming rain. She felt cold, and it wasn't due to the weather. Her enhanced brain moved at a supercharged rate, pouring through everything that had happened as the scalding water steamed across her bare body. She lathered herself thoroughly, pulling the soap across every part of her body. She felt disgusting, almost violated by the whole experience. And she was in the process of rinsing her hair when she heard the house go silent. The water pressure began dropping slightly. "Damn it!" she cursed, striking out to the shower wall with her fist. "Fuck!" she exclaimed as she pulled her fist from the wall. She had penetrated through the tile and the cement backboard behind before shattering the 2x4 stud at the centre, having likely damaged the wall on the other side as well. She shook her head. 2 years of being a vampire, and she was still having trouble remembering her strength at a time like this. Just great, she thought to herself, wondering how long she would spend half terrified and dying of boredom in her room, with nothing to do aside from wonder over those abominations that lurked outside. Stephanie opened the door to her little bathroom and began to cross her room, reaching for the towel on her bed. Her bedroom door creaked loudly as she turned to face her grandmother, fangs bared. Her once green-grey eyes were now glowing blue. Her features were feral. And Stephanie wanted to cry as the old woman rushed her with superhuman speed. Stephanie tried to avoid the attack but was unsuccessful, and the two vampires tangled together, grappling and rolling. Stephanie got her foot between their bodies and launched her grandmother's corpse through the wall. She tore through the house and leapt over the entire flight of stairs, and she intended to make it to her car and drive away, knowing she had clothes in the trunk. Before her feet could touch the ground, her grandmother slammed into her, carrying her across the room where her head was rammed into the stone hearth with bone-shattering force. While she was fighting to hold the snarling, fang-filled maw of Peggy at bay, as her grandmother clawed and viciously snapped at her, trying with all of her might to sink her fangs into her granddaughter's flesh. Stephanie's vision was blurred, but she could feel her skull mending itself. She had the woman by the throat, struggling to keep her at bay. And suddenly the entire house shook as timbers splintered and wet icy air flowed inward. Stephanie thought that fate had sent an airplane crashing into the house as her grandmother was pulled away with a savage force. Her eyes were filled with a mass of thick dark fur as a giant wolf whose body nearly consumed the entire room flung the body of her grandmother against the ceiling with its jaws. The giant's canines that impaled the body released as a lightning-fast paw flashed through the air, slamming the corpse against the floor with enough force to pulverize the decking and joists. And Stephanie sat stunned, too shocked to try and cover her still nude body, as she heard every bone in her grandmother's body shatter as she was ploughed through the floor and into the hard-packed stone-laden red clay below. Enormous, blazing red eyes pierced into her. Her hazel eyes lost a little colour as raw terror filled every part of her. An ungodly, deep voice exploded through her mind. "Were you bitten?" She slowly shook her head, no, as her grandmother began to regenerate. The old infected vampire sank her fangs into the soft webbing between the toes of the beast, pinning her broken body to the earth. And Tyler let out a snarl as he reared back, his head crashing through the ceiling timbers as he demolished nearly the entire front of the 2-story home. The only thing in nature that could pierce the flesh of a werewolf were the fangs of a vampire or another werewolf. He let out another howl before slamming his massive paw down again and again, claws ripping flesh, earth and wood, as if he were a cat swatting a mouse. Even the teeth of the giant back at the campsite could not penetrate his flesh, and suddenly he fully understood that this woman wasn't an infected human. He sank his claws through the woman's broken frame before slamming her backwards into the mantel directly onto the fine, nearly clear quartz dagger. The stone blade sank into the putrid flesh, and the woman began violently writhing before her body burst into blue light. And for a moment, she drifted to the floor as tiny ashes. The towel hung from the destroyed banister as Stephanie watched a huge werewolf grasp it in his teeth ever so gently, turning to hold it out before her trembling body. If it weren't more than 1,000 pounds of unbridled fury and destruction standing before her, she may have found the gesture nominally cute. There's a giant wolf standing in the ruins of my home that he destroyed in the process of keeping my grandmother from eating my face kind of way. As she reached out a trembling hand, took the towel as his voice echoed in her head once more, a little less violently, telling her to make herself decent. She leapt up what was left of the stairs to a mostly intact bedroom and dressed herself. And she returned to find a man with a deep tan and a shoulder-length hair, dressed in a pair of warm blue jeans and a black and grey patterned long-sleeve flannel shirt, calmly sitting beside a duffel bag, eating an entire loaf of French bread stuffed with at least 2 pounds of sliced deli-style ham. He was nonchalantly inspecting the dagger that had been her grandfather's, as if there wasn't basically an apocalypse going on just outside the perimeter of the broken home. She simply stared at him, wondering how he could remain so calm and how on earth he was able to eat so much food at once, considering his current body, of course. "I'm sorry for raiding your kitchen, ma'am. Well, that'll destroy most of your house," he said to her in a tired, raspy voice with a deep southern accent. "Obviously I don't care about the food, but I don't even know where to begin with the rest of everything. I'm not sure how I feel about any of this. What the hell are those damn things?" Tyler shook his head side to side slowly before letting it drop. His hair fell into a halo around his face. "Any chance you got a brush or a hair tie?" he asked her. After a few moments, she returned with the requested items, and after getting his hair under control, he began telling her everything. Once he recounted his story, he stood, lighting a cigarette, and then took a deep draw before collapsing forward, unconscious. Stephanie sprung forth in concern, catching him just before his nose would have smashed into the floor. She tried to rouse him to no avail. She elected to carry his dead weight to the storm shelter in the yard behind the house. It had a bed and plenty of candles for light. She wasn't sure if he would become hypothermic, but the destroyed house would provide little warmth or shelter. She propped him onto the bed in the corner before seating herself in the chair, lighting 3 candles on a small table that had a drawer full of them. His eyes fluttered and he mumbled incoherent words occasionally, and she watched his eyes for the blazing blue that she was terrified would fill them. Howls tore through the forest south of town. The pack was gathering, and there was an evil upon the land, and it was undeniable. Each of them could smell it on the wind as the sleet and freezing rain continued to pelt the world well into mid-afternoon. The big alpha male asserted that they would defend their forest at all costs. If the evil currently inundating the town were to spill forth into their home, 24 dogmen dropped their snouts and howled in their agreement. The dogmen were nowhere as large as the werewolf, roughly half the size, and they were primarily bipedal, and only the strongest could retake human form after the initial transformation. Much like werewolves, they had extremely tough skin and powerful jaws and wicked claws, all wrapped up into a smaller package. Their strength lay within their numbers. A pack this size was a true force to be reckoned with. The sun was fading when a strange smell of blood, death and power permeated the forest. The pack spread about setting their trap. All out war was coiled into a tight spring, ready to release like the spoon of a grenade at any moment. It was late afternoon when the howls tore the air across Stephanie's home. Tyler bolted upright, drawing breath, his irises glowing red already. He could feel changes burning in his veins, brought on by the bite of the infected vampire earlier that morning. He felt different, leaner, meaner, more lethal. He lit a cigarette as he stood moving towards the door to the subterranean room he was in, and Stephanie met him just outside. "Where are you going?" she asked. I have unfinished business, he replied. Are they your pack? No, I don't have a pack. Plus, those are dogmen, not werewolves. I'm coming with you, Stephanie said without hesitation. She sensed something different about Tyler. In all honesty, she had nothing left here. Fighting seemed to be her more noble action than sitting here in a cold, broken home, alone. Her grandmother was dead, and she had never known a father, and her mother had passed away in a car accident when she was very young. Her grandparents had raised her until Grandpa Bill died. Her grandmother was doing all right during the first year following his death. She grieved like any widow, slowly falling into depression. What's worse, Stephanie fell victim to the devilish advances of a slightly older man at a concert in Atlanta. The naive, then 17-year-old found herself in his hotel room after the concert. Her virgin body was nearly stripped bare to the very attractive man she nudged to be just over a few years older than herself. They began making their love, and she felt guilty, and a gut feeling told her to stop and run, but she couldn't make herself listen. It wasn't until the stranger's teeth tore into her neck, and her world faded to black from blood loss, that she came to understand exactly what she had done. She tried at first to hide her new condition from her grandma, but she was forced to reveal herself when a diagnosis of cancer came like an unwanted bullet to the face. And she elected to give her beloved grandmother life everlasting over being alone in a cold-hearted world. She felt selfish at first, but seeing her grandmother happily moving about like she was in her teens again had been well worth the trade. Stephanie had found Hollywood to be the stuff of myth. Aside from occasionally needing to consume blood, she was able to eat regular food. She never got sick, her menstrual cycle had halted, but silver and sunlight failed to harm her. Garlic and other substances with very potent smells were a slight annoyance to her heightened sense of smell, and this meant that smoking marijuana was definitely out of the question. She took notice that drugs and alcohol barely affected her new body, and at first she found it slightly dismal to be immortal without being able to at least achieve euphoria on occasion. And Tyler stepped out of his clothes, placing everything, with an exception of his boxers, into his duffel bag on top of his tobacco and the firearms he had collected before leaving a hunting club. He placed his favourite square-toe Justin boots and his real tree mesh snapback ball cap in the top of the bag. He lit a cigarette before zipping up the bag. The familiar black flames engulfed his body as the liberating sensations of transformation began. Stephanie watched in amazement as his huge true form was born from the slightly large human body. In only seconds, the black flame sputtered out and his enormous, glowing blood-red eyes locked onto hers. He told her to stay close, but retreat if they were to become overwhelmed. He reached his jaws towards his duffel bag, but Stephanie moved with the grace of a gazelle, slinging it over her shoulder in a motion so fast only his eyes could see her. "Don't worry, Wolfie. I'll take care of your stuff," she said before gently rubbing the soft fur above his lip along his snout. "Hey, woman, don't get me purring." His voice coiled through her mind as his eyes locked with hers. He shook his mighty head furiously before silently taking to a sprint. They covered the mileage to town in several minutes, skirting the outer perimeter. His enhanced vision picked out a few hundred of the original abominations, easily noticeable due to their advanced level of decay. And there were almost 1,000 newer abominations, likely all townsfolk taken by surprise by the impending horde that lay siege to the town. And to his dismay, he saw 6 more of the titan-like monstrous things. It had torn apart to the point it could no longer regenerate. Amongst the horde, he saw plenty of them that bore his claw and fang scars. The monsters were shambling back south towards the next town, destroying everything in their path like a tsunami, filtering through all manner of hiding place, hoping to add to their numbers. It was then that he realized that these things were created for one purpose: to create an indestructible army that wouldn't stop until their objective was completed. He figured out that they must be programmed to infiltrate and build their numbers, effectively eliminating the enemy while growing their force in size. This epiphany chilled him to the core as the wind picked up, scattering the still falling sleet and fog across the destroyed town barren of human life. He could not understand what insane entity would devise something of this sort. The mere aspect of it all was a plight of evil so horribly displayed before him. Tyler had collapsed, but he fell into what he could only describe as a spiritual journey. Beings older than man told him of how he would be their sword unto this plague, how he would become the flame upon these locusts. These ancient beings perverted the horrid infection coursing through his veins. They gave him the power to demolish this army. His very genetic code was altered. He had known for many years that he was a werewolf. He was born this way, of diluted ancient Cherokee blood. The magic laced deep within his anatomy, which had lain dormant for generations. What had been dreams of freedom in a wolf's body had become stark reality. He had come to understand his abilities and had mingled with society almost seamlessly. He had never been religious, but he had just seen what could only be 3 gods and 2 goddesses. And one of the gods had been a great bipedal wolf. The name Wahila came to mind. Another of the gods was a great winged thunderbird. He knew this one to be Horus. The third god was a powerful-looking man wielding a massive warhammer. He knew that this was Thor. The 2 goddesses were both very beautiful women, and one had golden hair and smelled like sunshine and grassy meadows. The other was silver-haired and moved about in the alluring shadows, smelling of sea and rain and storm. Neither of the goddesses were named in his mind, but he understood what they were. All 5 were the balance of nature, earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. All of them spoke as one being. He wasn't sure how his religious views were now impacted, and he wasn't sure what religion they represented. He only knew that he was their sword in the night, the fire against the dark, their shield against the natural order of life itself. Tyler and Stephanie stealthily moved around the town, and they made their way southwest towards the dogmen, who could now sense as they were nearing. Thankfully, the horde was moving south by southeast, moving somewhat away from their intended destination. Only a couple of 100 yards into the dense forest, amongst the shattering limbs and falling ice, the trap was sprung. The 2 were surrounded. More dogmen than they could count moved in to encircle them with gnashing teeth. Stephanie moved faster than a blink of an eye, and was several feet above the fray in the top of a tall oak tree, well out of reach of the creatures. Tyler, however, was sizing up the largest of the dogmen. He and the Alpha were squared off. The great werewolf's red eyes penetrated deep into the amber eyes of the Alpha. Wolves only understand power. He knew this as a singular gospel of his apex predatory nature. His massive hackles raised as he circled the motionless Alpha. Only his eyes followed the massive beast, reeking of death and unrelenting malice, the likes of which the Alpha Dogman had never met before. The blood-red eyes of the predator showed absolute 0 quarter. A fight with this beast could only end in death. The Alpha had a powerful pack, 24 loyal members, waiting to tear into the monster at the slightest aggression. And just as the Alpha tensed to make his move, the massive werewolf's fangs were already touching the flesh of his throat. He held them still. Yellow piss fell to the snow, and sleet accumulated on the forest floor. The Alpha rolled away from the wolf, tail tucked, showing the light of fur of his belly in surrender. The massive wolf reared his head back and released a howl that shattered the silence of the forest with an intensity of every bell in hell being struck with a thermonuclear force. The entire pack of dogmen joined in with a howl as Tyler lowered his mouth to the Alpha, grabbing his throat and shaking his body like a ragdoll until it went limp, with most of the bones in his neck and torso broken and splintered. He consumed the entire body of the broken Alpha in 4 smooth bites as the entire pack looked on at the carnage. He showed no remorse. Everyone knew that werewolves are assholes anyhow. And with his powerful body refueled, Tyler, with Stephanie and his pack in tow, broke into a sprint, now ready to deal death to his enemies, marching south towards more innocent civilians. Gary Widmore sat in a rocking chair before a fire that provided heat to his de-energized home he shared with his only son, his daughter-in-law and 2 grandchildren. Gary was 96 just 2 months before, and his hair, what hadn't fell to baldness, clung to his spotted scalp in thin white tufts. He could still get around slowly to make coffee and pull leftover meals from the icebox when he was alone to reheat on the stove. He needed a cane to move around, but he still had a few more summers left in the winter of his years. His son and family had braved the cold and harsh conditions to attend church in a town south of his home. He feared that they had become stranded as it was nearing 4 p.m. He hoped that they would find a hotel room for the night. Gary wasn't a religious type. All of the evil and sin he'd seen performed just miles north of his home had ensured his ticket to the Brimstone Inn. These days he sat sentinel, watching north, awaiting the day that evil would escape its iron prison. He knew that the land to the north contained a mass grave with nearly 500 souls laying cursed beneath 6 feet of red clay and stone. He knew the greatest evil of all, the catalytic fuel to the plague, lay entombed in the ever-aging concrete. One day it would burst free of its prison as well and raise its unholy army even if no one disturbed their resting place. He shivered at the thought. This was the day he had dreaded for more than 40 years. He felt it in his soul. He could see the blue eyes marching towards his home. He could feel the titanic evil bearing upon him. He pulled the satellite phone from the table beside the fireplace and keyed the pre-programmed number. 1 ring and a voice answered. He said his security code: Golf Mike Whiskey Delta Oscar Delta 749er Echo Uniform X-ray, before repeating 3 words: Eden has fallen. Eden has fallen. I repeat, Eden has fallen. The smooth voice on the other end of the encrypted line returned with, "Thank you, Mr. Widmore. We will advise the proper authorities. Thank you, sir." The line fell dead as he watched the wave of bodies move forth. A great creature standing on 2 legs, a body long and gaunt, with pale, emaciated flesh, torn in places, leaking black blood and leering with bright blue searchlight-like eyes, led the army of unholy abominations directly towards his home. The monster stood 30 feet tall, and the bare skull, half human, half elk, adorned with a massive 10-foot span of antlers. The Wendigo, the final piece to the super soldier puzzle, leading its hive mind army forth as Gary drew the .38 special revolver from the drawer of the table. He asked God to forgive his trespasses and asked Jesus as Lord of his heart and mind as he cocked the hammer and placed the barrel of the pistol to his chin. He gently squeezed the trigger, releasing the hammer. He felt nothing aside from the jolt of the revolver as a large jacketed hollow point entered his flesh, tearing a path through bone and soft tissue, followed by the combustion gases which further devastated his anatomy. His head slouched back and the slug bore into the rafter beyond the drywall above. The revolver fell from his hand, downward by the weight of the service weapon. His dead staring eyes didn't see the large hand of the Wendigo shatter a window and seize his lifeless body as cold air rushed in, and with a sound of snapping trees and the footfalls of an army marching south across his yard. He never saw the Wendigo completely consume his body as his soul drifted into a blank purgatory. His screams went unheard as he felt the heat of hell's fire below him. The Nightmare of Winter. Part 4. Let's get straight into that. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Let your plans be dark and as impenetrable as night, and when you move, fall like a thunderbolt. Sun Tzu, The Art of War, 500 BC. Master Chief Petty Officer Claude Hoffman stood in the hull of the speeding CH-47 Chinook as it soared through the sky, entering northeast Georgia airspace. 8 other Chinooks carrying Navy SEALs, Delta Force Rangers, and Marine Special Operators flew in formation. The transport choppers were accompanied by 20 AH-1Z and Viper gunships, each equipped with a 20mm M197 3-barreled Gatling cannon, and 12 AGM-114 Hellfire air-to-ground missiles. Hoffman was the commanding officer of this outfit of battle-hardened elite soldiers, and he caressed the grip of his Mk-23 sidearm, while his M4A1 assault rifle swayed with the pitch and yaw of the chopper. He mulled over the briefing he and his entire team were given 20 minutes after the call had come. This was a blacklisted site. His own government had twisted the laws of nature, and now he and his men were left to walk through the gates of hell to mop up this disaster. He knew these things basically didn't die. At best, they could only hope to contain him in such a way as to reactivate the dormancy of the infection. To make matters worse, the ground conditions were downright deplorable. The world below the streamlined craft, tearing through the cloudy winter skies, was a frozen no-man's land of icy devastation. Weather reports indicated a freak early winter storm had already encased the landscape in over an inch of ice and dumped 8 inches of sleet and snow. Basic intel indicated the entire region was without electricity and had limited cell service due to the onslaught Mother Nature had unleashed. The chopper began a descent before halting just 30 feet above the treetops. Hoffman and his men departed the craft via rappel into the icy wasteland below. At first glance, Hoffman was reminded of his hometown in Joplin, Missouri, after it was devastated by the EF5 tornado back in 2011. He and his men looked at what could only be ground zero. Absolute carnage surrounded them. What had once been a decent campsite was a decimated wreck of shredded trees, mangled vehicles, torn earth, and a camper that looked like a steamroller had been dropped on top of it. Other choppers soared away, taking various small teams to strategic points across the region for reconnaissance. Hoffman found the oddest sight to be the early 90s Nissan pickup truck, looking as though it had been hurled through the air like a weaponized spur of the Moment missile. Just as intriguing to him and his team was the human-like jawbone as big as a full-size truck hood, laying broken in half and with massive claw and tooth marks gouged into its surface. They found the remaining pieces of the monstrosity scattered about and strewn amongst the remains of many of the smaller wraiths. He couldn't fathom what manner of beast could be responsible for these findings. He had been told that the infected could be destroyed if their regenerative process was overwhelmed beyond a certain extent, but it was mentioned that this was nearly impossible. Just then, his radio buzzed.
The Wendigo has escaped the sarcophagus. Repeat, the Wendigo has escaped.
His shoulders dropped. The last thing he wanted to deal with was a mystical monster born of legend that had been biologically enhanced by the goons who called themselves doctors. Hoffman and his crew joined the choppers in a large clearing after receiving word that a horde and the Wendigo had been sighted. He was under the impression that these things were being jumped in their undying abilities. He had never met anything in his combat experience that could keep standing after being fed a magazine of 5.56 45 rounds. They would engage the enemy in a snare formation, from a safe distance of course, just to test the theories. Hoffman hoped that the original intel from decades ago was simply misinterpreted, and possibly with some luck they could mow the threat to the ground and burn the bodies and then be on their way. However, nothing is simple in war. Claude understood that anything could look great on paper, even visualized in a mind's eye, but rarely anything is so cut and dry when the bullets begin to fly. The great, monstrous werewolf and his newly acquired massive pack of dogmen thundered through the wilderness directly towards hell itself. The beautiful blonde vampiress, Stephanie, maintained his pace as they tore through the icy woodland, dodging between trees and brush. The dogmen were keeping the pace as well, loyal to their new leader, and they could feel the power and charisma flowing from him, and were embroiled and emboldened to take this unknown threat of abominations without question. Not one of them stood up to oppose their vicious leader after witnessing the sheer merciless treatment of their defiant alpha, and none of them preferred to visit the digestive tract of this great beast either. Tyler Hillmark broke from the forest onto the open frozen field south of town. The horde lay about a quarter mile to his southeast, and he abruptly stopped. His dogman companions wheeled up to his left and right, much like a medieval vanguard spread around their leader, and there was a different feel about the horde of unholy creatures. In that moment, he saw it. A much different beast, large like the 6 remaining titans dwarfing the regular-sized abominations. This long-limbed creature was thin and bony, and nearly solid white and patched with torn flesh and decay. On his head was a skull with great antlers, and his fingers ended in long spindly claws that slightly curved. Its blue eyes bore into his own. He wasn't sure what he was looking at, but it radiated pure evil. The entire horde stopped all motion before turning to stare at the small but powerful force assembled before them. The creature bellowed a roar as the wind swept up, and Tyler answered with an ear-shattering howl that drowned out the cacophony of the joining dogmen and the great evil thing's wail. Righteous bloodlust coursed through his body, and he felt power like never before as his mind began to buzz and black flames began to engulf his pores. His eyes blazed in an unnatural fury, like wind-blown embers, as he placed one paw in front of the other slowly, beginning to advance, a sinister smile wickedly playing across his wolfen muzzle. And riding his hubri, the dogmen began to advance. The Wendigo raised its right hand with an outstretched claw in their direction, and the horde began sprinting towards their vicious army, advancing forward. Tyler and Stephanie tore forth on a warpath, claws and fangs, and a stone dagger, ravaging the advancing abominations. The wraiths fell into glowing ash as the claws and fangs of Tyler, as he ripped his way through everything in his path like a demonic brush hog. The dogmen gained upon the wraiths, tearing them into shreds repeatedly as they regenerated. The massive werewolf was on a warpath, his vision tunneling, with only the antlered giant defined as his goal. He came upon one of the titanic colossus beasts going bipedal to grapple the thing to the frozen earth. They rolled and crashed upon the wraiths, mangling the smaller things like meaningless toys beneath them. Tyler sunk his giant fangs into the throat of the colossus beast as it shook and seized before exploding into ash-laden blue flames. His small victory was short-lived as one of the other colossus gripped his hind leg and held him into the air before bringing him to the cold, hard earth in a bone-shattering body slam. Two more of the great monsters fell upon him, fists pounding, teeth gnashing, as their horde piled upon him like a sea of corpses. And he fought to draw air into his massive lungs as the weight crushed him. His jaws flashed like lightning, the clasp of each bite like thunder. His claws whirled like an unholy blender, and for every one he mangled to ashes, more piled on top. As his hope began to fade, he felt his pack piling onto the horde, ripping and tearing at the titanic monsters, allowing him to break free. One of the colossus beasts grabbed Dogman and ploughed her into the frozen soil. Her shattering bones announced her end, as Tyler's jaws snapped around its neck in a full-fledged retribution as it burst into ashes. The rest of the pack had the remaining 4 titans firmly on the ground, ripping and tearing them and forcing them to stay down. The Wendigo was moving towards him, its evil raining from its body with each step. He moved from the battle, circling and sizing the opponent as they engaged in a mortal combat. And the battle of righteous deliverance assaulting ancient evil began. An unstoppable force rushed to meet an unmovable object with teeth bared and claws flaming. The werewolf and the massive Wendigo froze 20 yards from arm's length as rotor wash sounded to the cacophony of automatic 20mm cannons. Both were pelted by the massive bullets, feeling like a swarm of hornets to Tyler as he retreated. Hellfire missiles slammed both into the Wendigo and his pack still engaging the horde, and he made the tree line as he turned to watch his own soldiers being blasted and shredded by the fire raining from the foggy sky. He scanned frantically for Stephanie and found her crawling to the tree line also, around 400 feet away. Her left leg nearly torn away by the massive automatic fire that was still raining down behind her. And he burst into a sprint, making it to her in less than a minute before scooping her gently between his jaws, and he ran hard for the trees and turned to witness 2 Apache gunships coming in close on the Wendigo. They had used all of their missiles and engaged it with their Gatling cannons. The Wendigo leapt impossibly high into the air and grasped the front of one of the choppers before hurling it to the earth. It bellowed a rage as it scooped up a great handful of earth and wildly launched it to the other helicopter, nearly knocking it from the sky. Tyler watched the other choppers disengage and turn back north as the Wendigo raged and his horde regenerated. He saw the majority of his dogmen pack rise again, blue-eyed and menacing, while the rest lay silent in death. And he turned and sprinted back towards the town. He was done with this fight, done for this day. His forces were demolished, and he didn't fully understand how vampires dealt with grievous injuries. He crossed another field on his flight northward, when a sudden bright light burst in front of him, and his ears rang as his vision blurred with concussion. Another blast sent him reeling as the rocket-propelled grenade detonated on impact right beside him. He dropped Stephanie as he howled with confusion and pain. Another blast hit him in the throat as he fell panting onto the snow and sleet that blanketed the earth. He tried to get to his feet, his head was spinning, but failed. He lay in the cold embrace of the slush surrounding him, with his eyes half open as the wind whipped around him, stirred by the rotors of a Chinook. He read the name, C. Hoffman, boldly printed across the chest of the digital camouflage jacket, as another of the men who put him on his ass rammed a large syringe into his neck. He could feel himself losing his form, reverting back to his human body. A burst of adrenaline swelled through him as he burst from the dirt, fist raised, ready to blindly attack anyone he could reach. A single blow from Claude Hoffman's .45 Auto MK-23 sidearm sent him reeling as he felt a man's hand close around his wrist before the feeling of flight entered his mind. The cold ground made him hard. The last sensation he felt was handcuffs closing around his wrists as he was then picked up and tossed roughly into the belly of the chopper. Stephanie bared her fangs, not ready yet to defend herself with her mutilated leg still in the process of healing. She watched in anguish as the big soldier bashed Tyler across the face with his pistol, splitting his nose wide open before wrenching him over his shoulder and slamming him to the ground. Her supernatural hearing allowed her to hear several bones crack as the air gushed from his lungs. And they brutally cuffed his wrists and carried him to the chopper. The big soldier walked to her as she looked at him murderously. "I'm Claude Hoffman. You and your friend are going to take a little ride with us," he said to her roughly. She narrowed her eyes at him. "Cooperate or I'll put a mag of hot lead through his skull." She raised her wrists together and another soldier cuffed her. Her blonde hair was roughly gripped and her head wrenched towards the chopper as she was dragged like a meaningless garbage aboard the craft. The Chinook took off and reeled north. Stephanie felt her insides turn as it pitched sharply for the turn. She could feel bad intentions in this group directed towards her. She knew the real interest was in Tyler and his wilder side. After a few minutes, her hearing picked up the whispers of two of the soldiers sitting towards the front. "After the vamp bitch's leg heals, I vote we pass her around for some fun," one chuckled quietly. The other was about to speak when Tyler's red eyes flashed open and he gave a savage growl that drowned out the sound of the chopper. His teeth were bared, already taking the appearance of a wolf's. The handcuff snapped with a metallic twang as he started to rush the man making the comments about Stephanie. He made it halfway and was partially transformed when a soldier rammed another syringe into his chest as he passed. He fell to the floor, twitching as his form receded again. They handcuffed him again, and this time with 8 pairs, before chaining his ankles to the cargo rail with 3 pairs of shackles. The second soldier from before looked at the one who had made the comment and said, "I don't think you'll be seeing any of her sweet meat, as long as her werewolf boyfriend has anything to say about it." The first guard, still pale-faced, shook his head. The Chinook sat itself down in a huge field painted white with a precipitation. As the cargo door opened, Stephanie saw dozens of big canvas tents situated among several transport choppers and many gunships like the one she'd fallen victim to during a battle. She was roughly grabbed and dragged to one of the tents far down the row near a very large pond. Inside there were steel cages with impossibly thick bars and a single propane heater warming the air. She was pushed into a cage and the heavy door slammed behind her. Tyler was then dragged in, still heavily handcuffed and semi-lucid, and placed in a cage beside her. Several hours passed as she heard helicopters taking off and return. She heard the explosions of missiles and distant machine gun fire echoing off the ice-coated landscape. Night had long since fallen, and Tyler, despite being wrapped in a green blanket, shivered. The flap to the tent whipped open as she heard trees breaking in the brisk wind that tore through the encampment. A dark-haired soldier passed through the opening, letting the canvas fall again behind him. He carried Tyler's duffel bag and a key on a lanyard. The bag was noticeably lighter. He eyed the vampiress, locked behind the steel bars warily as he reached into his cargo pocket and produced a medical blood bag and handed it to her. She gingerly accepted the offering and then looked at the soldier. He removed his backpack and handed her a MRE, which read, Menu 3, chicken, egg noodles, and vegetables and sauce. He told her that the instructions were on the back as he passed her 3 bottles of water. She gave him her best fake, "I'd love to rip your throat out and drink your lifeblood through a straw," with a little umbrella poolside smile. The man nodded to her and walked to Tyler's cage. "Hey buddy, are you awake? I have the key." He started as Tyler rose, breaking all 8 pairs of cuffs. The blanket fell away, exposing him as he grabbed it and wrapped it around his waist. "Dude, chill, those are fucking expensive," the soldier said to Tyler as he gestured for him to extend his arms. The soldier removed the broken handcuffs from each of his wrists with a key. He passed the duffel bag through a big slot in the door to the cage, and Tyler instantly ripped open the zipper and lit a cigarette. "Where the fuck are my guns?" Tyler barked as if he were the soldier's superior. "Whoa, big guy, we have them safely put up and nobody's gonna keep them, I swear." "You better open this goddamn door, take me to my shit, or I'll rip it off its hinges and I'll ram it down your throat," Tyler raged at the poor soldier. "Sir, please calm down. You need to get dressed. The Master Chief just wants to ask you some questions and then he's gonna turn you loose." "I don't believe a word of that crap," Tyler said as he tugged on a pair of Wrangler jeans and frayed edges, a little hole in the right knee. "Sir, please, we only need to understand exactly what happened here." The soldier passed Tyler an MRE and Tyler looked at him with a scowl. "I want 4 of those and a 12-pack of Coors Light." The soldier passed him 3 more of the rations and told him that he would see what he could do about the beer. Tyler caught his wrist and wrenched him to the door, his eyes burning blood red with fury. "I have a cooler full of beer just down that trail. If you can't find what I want here, then you'll march your candy ass up there and you'll get 'em, or so help me God, the next time I see you, I'll eat you whole." He let the soldier go as the man stepped back, trembling so hard his Delta Force patch threatened to fall from his shoulder. Yes, sir. I'll do everything I can for you." Before the soldier left the tent, Tyler noticed that his name tag read D. Ramirez. After he left and the flap fell back into place, Tyler pulled on his square-toe boots, flannel shirt and Carhartt jacket before donning his camouflage hat. "Well, that was really brutal," Stephanie remarked. "They attacked us with explosives. I'm not about to be nice to these Neanderthals," he said to her. "I'm pretty sure he needs to change his underwear," she said with a giggle. The tent flap opened again and Master Chief Claude Hoffman stepped through with 2 armed soldiers. And Tyler recognized him immediately as the prick who'd pistol whipped him. "I could kill you where you stand," Tyler said to him in a voice colder than the icy wind ripping through the night on the other side of the canvas. As if to accentuate his claim, a large tree splintered as the weight of the ice accumulated on its branches, towed it to the earth in the brisk wind. "I think we got off to a bad start here, Mr. Hillmark," the commanding officer said to him in a steady voice, brushing off the threat. "You call decimating my pack and attacking me and my girl with a fucking explosives a bad start? I call that starting a goddamn war with the wrong individual." His girl? Stephanie blushed at the mention of herself in such a possessive and intimate manner. "I would like to first apologize for that whole business," the man said. His clean-shaven face was lined and hard, and his neatly trimmed hair had a few traces of grey streaked through it. He had those all-too-serious, steely blue eyes that seemed to stare through the soul, while failing to give a hint otherwise. "I was close to killing that thing, ending this nightmare, and then you and your soldier boys came tromping through with your helicopters and royally fucked everything." "Son, you can't kill those things, even if you are the big bad wolf in these parts. Trust me, I've killed enough of them to say otherwise." "So, I take it that you're the thing that destroyed the camp at the center of the trails due south of here. You damn well know I'm the only thing in these woods that can cause that level of destruction. What about your pack? Why were those werewolves so much smaller than you?" "They weren't my pack, and they weren't werewolves. They were dogmen, and I killed their alpha so I could use them as a distraction," Tyler replied to the Master Chief coldly. "So you mean to tell me that you're just a wandering savage beast that happened into this whole, situation?" Tyler repeated his entire story of hunting with his friends and simply being thrust into the situation via happenstance. and when he got to the part about meeting Stephanie, he decided to leave out the part about being bitten and the whole spirit journey that he took. The commander nodded. "Well, sir, thank you for at least explaining how the two of you ended up here." So that's it then?" Tyler said in a more of a statement than a question. "As I see it, son." Hoffman stood to leave. "Then how about you return my weapons and open these cells? I'm feeling a little bit cramped." Hoffman spun on his heel. "Leave? So soon?" He chuckled. "I don't think you understand, boy. I can't just allow a monster to run rampant in the streets. Both of you are a danger to society. You fine specimens don't want to miss the fireworks, either." Hoffman said this with a laugh while Tyler became infuriated. His anger permeated the room. "Hey, Hoffman!" The Master Chief poked his head back through the tent flap. "When I get out of here, you are the first item on the menu." Hoffman laughed again. "Not likely, boy." Outside the tent, he heard the officer tell his men, "No food or water, but leave the heat on. I want them comfortable until the fireworks start." Stephanie looked at Tyler's raging body. She reached through the bars and caressed his upper arm through the sleeve of the heavy jacket. "They're going to bomb the entire area, aren't they?" she said to him. "More than likely they will. They see you and I as loose ends that need to be tied up." Do you think we will survive?" "It's possible, if they use conventional bombs, but if they use nukes, I'm not so sure." "They can't hide nukes from the rest of the world, though. Plus, all the radiation and fallout. Do you think that a nuke would kill that thing with the antlers?" she said, lowering her eyes to the soggy dirt and grass floor outside of the cages. They can cover up anything these days. They staged 9/11 and got the entire world to believe that terrorists did it by crashing planes into buildings," he said to her. "Tyler?" "What's up, Steph?" "I never thanked you for saving me earlier. My grandma would have bitten me if you hadn't come along when you did." "That's not every day you get to save a half-naked vampire damsel in distress from zombies," he said to her with a laugh, and it seemed that they were going to get nuked to death at some point. He might as well try to make her laugh. "Well, when we get out of here and end this whole thing, what do you want to do?" she asked. "Well, if we manage to get free, I'm pretty sure we'll be the top 2 on America's Most Wanted." He pondered, wondering if his old life from just a couple of days ago was even possible to ever reclaim. "What's your thoughts on tropical locations?" she said. "Salt water and coconut oil are really bad for my fur." Stephanie laughed. "You know, I haven't asked, and I'm curious, seeing as we're pretty much looking at like ultimate doom and gloom. What about your love life? Are you seeing anyone currently?" "Nah, I haven't dated in about a year," he said. "If we get out of here, I'll be Bonnie, if you want to be Clyde." And Tyler chuckled. "I prefer Vicky and Vance." And Stephanie giggled. "I love Fallout New Vegas." "That's my all-time favorite roleplay / first-person shooter," he said. "It's more of a strategy game." "About like this whole deal?" he said, gesturing to the undeniable foobar shitstorm they found themselves standing in. "I'm assuming that stuff they injected you with is halting your ability to change," she asked. "Yeah, but I can feel it wearing off. I'm not sure how it would go if I tried to turn in this little box I'm in, though." Suddenly, Ramirez slipped under the wall of the tent from behind with his finger to his lips. And first, he handed a beer to Tyler. "This is the only one I could find," he whispered. "Listen, guys, sometime between now and tomorrow, they're going to blow this whole area, the town and all, to Kingdom Come." "Yeah, I already know," Tyler said, cutting him off. "They're going to let you two fry, and it's not right. I'll be put to death if they find out, but here, take this." he said, handing Tyler the key to the cells. In 40 minutes, it's going to sound like the whole battalion is leaving. Slip out the back and get your asses gone. And they won't be checking back on the two of you again. Ramirez then left the way he came. Another whisper came through the canvas, barely audible over the howling wind. A hand then slipped Tyler's pistol, holster, and 2 boxes of 40 S&W ammunition onto the wall before the canvas was cinched back tight. Tyler unlocked his cell and then stepped out and unlocked Stephanie's. Her arms went out and around him, and her lips quietly met his as tears streamed down her face. Her leg was almost completely healed, and Tyler's face barely showed even a scratch from the pistol whipping he'd received earlier. They broke their embrace, and Tyler loaded the magazine on his pistol before stubbing it in the holster on his hip and putting the ammunition in the duffel bag. He lit a cigarette and handed one to Stephanie as a gunshot sounded just a short distance from the tent. He peered carefully through the flap. Ramirez was on his knees in a row of icy ground between the 2 lines of tents. A bullet had been fired through his knee. Hoffman walked up to him and put the barrel of the Mk-23 to his forehead before dispatching him. He holstered his weapon. He started towards the tent housing the prisoners, but froze. Tyler stood gunslinger style, feet wide apart on the icy ground. His hand was positioned. His red eyes bore into those of the Master Chief's. The officer's hand slightly twitched towards the service weapon, but Tyler's draw was inhumanly fast. His pistol cleared the leather with unholy grace as 4 bullets tore through the frozen night air. One found Hoffman's right hand, and 2 more took his knees, and the final one burst straight through his throat. Hoffman staggered 1 step, 2 steps, before splitting up a wad of blood that steamed as it left his lips. His eyes looked dead and empty as they stayed locked with Tyler's, while he sank to his knees. He fell face forward and gave a couple of spasms as he tried to draw a final breath. 5 men burst from the tents further down the row, weapons ready, but Tyler was already on the draw. 4 shots left in his Smith & Wesson, each finding purchase on their targets. One of the bullets managed to perform a double-headed shot before any more personnel could respond. Tyler and Stephanie disappeared into the all-consuming darkness of the forest just beyond the encampment. And they didn't stray far as they saw the blue eyes in the distance marching in on the troops. Small arms began firing as gunships began spinning up in preparations to take to the sky. And Tyler could feel the last of the serum wearing off his body as the predator inside him began to smile its demonic grin. He watched the lumbering giants and the big antlered bastard marching up the northern trail as its horde streamed forth before it. Stephanie could feel Tyler's body coiling tight like a spring in anticipation as she held onto him, half lovingly, half thankfully, and slightly terrified of what she knew he would soon do. Tyler was waiting. He could feel the beast within and the righteous purpose of which it had bestowed upon him. He lay there and waiting, understanding both himself and his enemy in full context as he watched the gunships assault the monsters with missiles and bullets. He watched the rockets launch from the shoulders of soldiers, flying out to impact targets. The Colossus beast began advancing on the groups of soldiers, fanning out, leaving the Wendigo exposed, and Tyler waited. The Wendigo held chunks of earth at the choppers as they assaulted it further with missiles. And with the Wendigo in full distraction and unguarded, Tyler moved around the perimeter of the field as fast as his human legs could move. He kept out of sight as he watched. And the Wendigo was moving backwards to the cover of the trees as the Colossus were down, felled by missiles and cannon fire. Death continued to rain from the sky as the black fire consumed Tyler once more. He kept his glowing red eyes down as he moved silently through the edge of the forest. The massive Wendigo roared as it hurled an uprooted tree, and one of the Hellfire missiles found its way inside its mouth where it detonated. The evil monstrosity stumbled as the world spun around it. Another missile found purchase right beside the Titanic being's foot, and it toppled it into the trees as the jaws of the great apex predator closed upon it. Its world spun around it. Another missile found purchase right beside the Titanic being's foot. It toppled over into the trees as the jaws of the great apex predator closed upon it. The Nightmare of Winter, Part 5. Let's get straight into that. Officer Ryan Kelly shivered violently in his torn duty jacket as he finally made it to the door of Eddie Bose Harris's single wide trailer. Ryan had trudged for an unknown number of hours. He had no recollection of the current date or time. His badge lay somewhere amongst the snow and ice on a barren stretch of highway near a wrecked semi and its crushed patrol car. His pistol hung in its holster, containing one chambered 9mm hollow point round, which he was saving for himself in case he succumbed to hypothermia in this winter wasteland. Ryan gave 3 short knocks on the derelict door, which rattled on its flimsy aluminium hinges. He watched the peephole darken for a moment in the twilight that unfolded as the light faded from an ever shorter winter day. He heard a woman's raspy voice from within. "Hide the shit! It's the cops!" Before hearing Bo's familiar voice from further within. Just put your shit up, y'all. I'll handle it." The darkness overtook the peephole again before the door wrenched open and squealing on its hinges. "Ryan, what the hell brings you here?" "Wait, what the hell? You look like hammered shit, and where's your car?" Ryan shrugged his shoulders as the wind picked up the sound of splintering wood and shattering ice all around him in the dense woodland that encircled the property. Bo ushered him inside, explaining to his friends that he was cool. Ryan walked in, eyeing the coffee table in the tiny den warmed by a large glowing propane heater in the center of the room. On the table, illuminated by the lantern and a candlelight, he saw a big pile of white powder, a safety razor, and a $5 bill neatly rolled into a straw. And without a word, he stiffly moved to the table and drew a big line of cocaine before greedily drawing it into his nostril with a heavy intake of breath through one side, while his finger firmly pressed the other side closed. He grabbed a bottle of Absolute vodka from the woman, her sore-spotted brow furrowed intensely as she watched him down the contents without hesitation before drawing 2 more lines of white powder and inhaling them with the fervor of a veteran user. "God damn, man, what the hell has got you so worked up?" Bo asked him as he felt the warmth of alcohol spread through half his frozen body. His face and his lips went numb as the euphoria of 2 poisons coursed through his system, like a tidal wave of collegiate nostalgia. The song White House Road by Tyler Childers played in the corner at a low volume. "We've been sniffing that cocaine, ain't nothing better than the wind cuts cold. Lord, it's a mighty hard living, but a damn good feeling to run these roads." And Ryan smirked slightly as the song cut to an instrumental break of steel guitar strumming. Ryan lit a cheap menthol cigarette from a pack half empty he'd found on the end of the table next to the couch, and he plopped himself onto it as the girl, likely somewhere between 17 to 20, came from the back room, wearing only a robe and holding a bong to take a seat beside him. She said her name was Rachel, but Ryan was somewhere far off in his thoughts, only brought back to reality when the song changed to Copperhead Road by Steve Earle. He looked at Bo with his steely grey eyes suddenly filled with a burning intense seriousness. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said to the drug-dealing friend he had known since high school. Bo had enlisted in the Marines just after graduation and spent 2 tours of duty in the Middle East before losing half his left hand and his hearing on one side to a roadside bomb. After a medical discharge, he found himself partially broken and turned to peddling coke and other drugs as well as entertaining a bit of prostitution among the various girls that drifted through his home at times. "You try me, lawman. You owe me that much for the liquor and blow you just put down like it was your last meal." Ryan recounted everything from the crash he'd pulled up onto, more than 20 miles back towards the other town, to the horde of what he can only describe as zombies, all the way to the point of a giant wolf, a werewolf, maybe, thing. He described how it came through the horde of undead things, like a steamroller, crossed up with a wood chipper, and then tangled for a while with a huge creature that fell onto his patrol car as the wolf thing ripped and tore at it like a hurricane of teeth and claws. The others stared at him, wide-eyed, hanging on to every word. He recounted how the blue-eyed things just kept getting back up, no matter the number of bullets nor teeth that they endured. The drug and alcohol-induced stupor spurred his tale on, as he said how the other officers and first responders were ripped limb from limb by the horde, as he retreated only to be swept into the wolf's maw and carried a long distance as its paws pounded the icy earth. He finished his rendition of the events as Bo and Sarah both burst out laughing like they belonged in an insane asylum. "How much blow did you do before you got here?" Bo exclaimed with a loud snort of laughter. Ryan's blood boiled as he stood almost in a blur, tearing the duty jacket from his chiseled form and giving light to the perfect pattern of wolf-like teeth marks torn into his flesh along his torso. Rachel gasped as Bo looked at him seriously. "Looks like you tangled with an alligator on the way here. Ain't nobody ever told now to fry bacon without a shot, boy. Now calm down and tell us what really happened before that dope blows a fuse in that head of yours." "I'm not bullshitting you, Eddie," Ryan said as he began to rage. "Honestly, buddy, I think you need to get some help. Obviously that meth or whatever you've been on has toasted your mind." At that, Ryan crossed the room in 2 steps and Bo was dangling by his throat, locked firm in Ryan's white-knuckled grip. Ryan's eyes burned brilliant red as the anger surged through him in racking waves. Black flames consumed his form as white fur poured from his flesh. His bones broke as muscle and tendons rearranged. And within moments, the blow and booze burned away, leaving his mind crystal clear. Bo's vertebrae shattered in his grip as his windpipe was flattened and his arteries burst beneath the pallid sun-deprived skin. Both women started screaming as the huge wolf's body engaged the majority of the small room. He tossed the man's body with a mighty roar as the floor beneath him collapsed under his weight and force. The walls and ceiling burst as he tore forth in his rage. The older of the 2 women was crushed beneath his massive rear paw as he left. Rachel was scurrying away across the yard, her robe flapping about her as it slipped from her body, exposing her nude flesh to the bitter cold wind. Ryan's mind took a backseat ride as the beast within him ravaged everything in sight. He had no control as his huge mouth closed around her new body, snapping her in 2 like a fresh carrot. He felt little remorse as the beast he had become sequestered his conscious thoughts into submission as he consumed the meal. A shotgun blast struck him across his face and neck as he heard the man Rachel had been entertaining racking another round. The buckshot seared against his flesh as his anger boiled further into a madness. He rounded on the thug who let out another full blast into his face, while his flesh, barely scratched by the inferior assault, mended and he lurched forward, crushing the hopeless bastard vertically between his teeth. The man's femurs ripped through his shoulders before they shattered against Ryan's teeth. His life was extinguished in one scream and a vicious crunch, before a mighty gulp turned his wrecked mass into another part of Ryan's meal. His red eyes glared into the night as retribution filled his thoughts. He was off padding hard on silent paws as his claws raked harshly into the snow and with the wind bellowing in his long blood-smeared fur. Master Sergeant Dan Cross fired his last Hellfire missile into the face of the great antlered beast and watched in awe as it exploded just inside the creature's maw as another missile collided with its leg just below the knee that sending it off its balance and toppling to the frozen earth below. His gunship's munitions were expended and the ground forces looked to be overwhelmed by the horde that was upon them to replenish his weaponry. The craft had about 30 minutes of fuel left as he decided to wheel it back towards his base. He knew he couldn't make it all the way, but he could remove himself far away from this disaster unfolding below him. Halfway into his orient, a colossus hurled a large crate into a Black Hawk off to the far left of the current theatre. The helicopter spun in an attempt to regain control as one of its door gunners let loose a volley of 50 caliber machine gun rounds wildly into the twilight sky. Several of the rounds impacted the engine compartment of Cross's Apache, stalling the engine. His craft fell from the sky as he desperately tried in vain to control the machine. He ejected, smashing his head against the canopy. His unconscious body drifted towards the ground as the parachute caught in the trees. The other helicopters turned away from the fight, putting distance between themselves and the nightmare displayed below. Without munitions, they were useless. As the great Wendigo fell to the icy earth in an attempt to turn and catch itself, it felt the great jaws of the unholy werewolf close about its exposed throat. The monster's body froze in mid-freefall before a violent shaking began. Teeth and claws were landing furiously across its head and upper torso. And within moments the Wendigo found purchase and righted itself. It seized the massive creature in its huge clawed hands and slung it like a ragdoll into the trees. Limbs and trunks alike splintered before the velocity of the massive beast. The Wendigo was looking forward to vanquishing this foe, a worthy meal to fuel its insatiable hunger for flesh. The putrid, spindly corpse of the evil being smoothly rushed towards its prey that it had flung against the trees. 2 steps forward and it found itself hit by a tooth and claw-laden freight train of raw, unbound fury as Tyler unleashed himself upon the monstrosity once again. The momentum and titanic force wrenched the Wendigo from its feet once again as it hit the ground hard, sliding backwards on its right shoulder. I had tried to fend off the vigorous attacks that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The monster seized the wolf by the hind leg, long sword-like claws ripping into the tough hide of the great beast. It hurled the creature around by the leg, smashing it repeatedly into the icy ground with bone-shattering force. The Wendigo launched the wolf into a huge oak tree, shattering the trunk as the body wrapped around it. The Wendigo moved towards its prey, and the maw of the beast whipped straight into the face of the monster, spewing black flames as the beast bit down hard upon the face of the abomination, shearing one of the huge antlers from its head. The Wendigo howled in pain as it clawed the torso of the beast almost fruitlessly, attempting to extricate its face as flames burned away its flesh. The wolf pulled it to the near submission and then burst into a sprint, slamming it head first remorselessly into everything in the path of the ultimate destruction. And once again, the Wendigo freed itself, getting its huge hand between the jaws of the beast. As soon as its head was free, the beast ripped its jaws into the Wendigo's forearm, shaking and rolling like a tornado until the monster's arm severed in its maw. The Wendigo was already regenerating its wounds as it mounted the offensive, clawing heavily upon the wolf's face and eyes. Back and forth, unstoppable forces crashed upon unyielding objects as the two traded blow for blow, claw for fang, neither tiring and neither showing mercy in this titanic battle of ferocious bloodlust and rage. The blue eyes of the horde turned from the nearly decimated ranks of soldiers, desperately fending them off with machine gun and mortar fire. One by one they faced the two titanic beings as their hive mind set them into motion. At once they burst into a sprint as the soldiers faced the horrific battle taking place on the other end of the expansive snow-laden field. The clouds tore free of the darkened sky as the light of a nearly full-blood moon poured down upon the battleground. Giant red and blue eyes flashed as the beasts traded massive blows of teeth and claws, ripping and tearing at each other. And some of the soldiers rushed to evacuate as others stood entranced by the massive battle raging like hellfire. And Stephanie, she watched her massive lover ravaging the Wendigo, and tears fell from her eyes as she stared hopelessly at the carnage. She could only wonder how long either of them could keep this battle going, and surely Tyler was sustaining injuries, judging by the earth-rattling impacts of the blows the Wendigo landed as the air itself reverberated around her. The ground shook each time Tyler dragged the monster down by the head or throat, and she watched again and again as the two slammed each other with paws and fist as they grappled relentlessly to gain ground on the other. She saw the monster pick the entire wolf off the ground, only to have teeth engulf its face as Tyler used the momentum to carry it into an explosive body slam. The stump of a shattered pine tree impaling the creature through its torso. The Wendigo bellowed an ear-shattering howl of pain as Tyler set upon grabbing its arms to tear it away with sickening, ripping sounds. The jaws of the wolf closed again and again upon the body of the monster, and she could feel her lover's malice as he tore away parts of limbs and massive chunks of flesh. And then the horde closed in. The massive titans seizing his body as he twisted and writhed, attacking them as they fought to pull him to the earth. Stephanie screamed hopelessly, knowing she could do little to help in her state of blood deprivation. Fully aware that she was vulnerable to the bite of the creatures either way, she wept as she watched them slam him over and over into the dirt, fists falling as the rest of the horde fell upon his body. And a Wendigo rose its horrific claws, poising above his beaten body, and the Colossus continued hammering away at him, keeping him down as the entire horde crushed his body under their weight. She felt him fading, and the Wendigo moved upon him, its claws falling against him repeatedly, coming back bloodier and bloodier as his pained howls rang through the forest above the cacophony of death blows raining down. She fell to her knees, her body begging for sustenance. She could do nothing but watch as these abominations killed him. Men and women for miles around heard the death howls of their own kind as the black flames consumed their bodies and red eyes glowed. And throughout the forests and hollers, yellow-eyed dogmen's ears picked up as they moved into motion towards the heinous sound of a fellow canine in distress. In the deepest, untouched wilderness, the ancient guardians of the land stirred into motion. There, titanic stone and wooden forms, moving as the divine ones, whispered to them. The gentle giants who kept the land in small colonies heard the whispers of their gods, and were drawn forth. The masses of the wilderness moved in unison to the great battle to which they were called. The ground shook and heaved as ice fell from trees. The wind howled with the calls of the masters. A great vessel of divine power was locked in mortal combat. Ryan heard the howls of his maker, and he was instantly drawn to them. His paws thundered upon the ground, carrying him forth at near lightning speed. The soldiers snapped out of their stupor when the Wendigo's claws began falling upon the wolf. They took up arms and moved forward, firing upon the monster from afar. The beast roared and turned its attention to the men. It marched forward with its horde, leaving the wolf laying battered and broken on the blood-soaked snow. The soldiers took up defensive positions as the Wendigo closed the distance, nearly impervious to the machine gun fire. Tyler's body, filled with ancient magic, was already healing as his red eyes glowed even brighter. Stephanie rushed to him, but couldn't move his massive form in her weakened state. She begged him to get up, to leave and to stop fighting. He refused her, glaring at her with his eyes smouldering into hers as his voice boomed inside her skull like a freight train with a southern drawl. He stood shaking himself like a soaked dog as the Wendigo and its horde decimated the remaining soldiers in a symphony of screams and fruitless gunfire until the battleground fell absolutely silent. Tyler took slow, silent steps as the monster and its masses wheeled around to stare at him. Within 20 paces, the last of the limp left in his form, his healing was complete. A vicious growl ripped from his throat as he circled the enormous field. The eyes of the Wendigo followed him as he swiped and smashed the small wraiths that tried to rush him. his anger and malice overflowing as it tainted the battlefield. He circled and circled, picking off little bits of the horde as the Wendigo and its titans stood sentinel, watching his movements. The Wendigo could not believe his enemy stood again and moved as if untouched by the assaults. Growls and howls and wails filled the night air as more than 100 glowing eyes filled the woodline. The dogmen and werewolves sauntered forth from the trees, led by a great white beast nearly as big as Tyler himself. A few purple-eyed Sasquatches entered the field as 3 great lumbering beings, smelling of old magic and decay, followed behind. These beings were eyeless, standing nearly 100 feet tall, and the wolves and dogmen lowered their heads in reverence of the great massive wolf between them and the evil abominations. The Wendigo began moving forward with the horde in tow. The beasts of the land wasted no time as they rushed to meet the wraiths, as the ancient ones with no eyes nor emotion zeroed in on the colossus with the unfathomable fury. The Guardians' indiscernible battle cry shaking the land with their great cries, sounding like glaciers grinding into bedrock. Lightning flashed from their stone hands, bursting forth like whips, wrapping the massive abominations, while unending thunder sounded about the plasma of the great being's weaponry. Only Tyler and Ryan were left to engage the Wendigo, and the 3 squared off as the Wendigo roared defiantly at the massive beasts it faced before it. They were upon the monster like a hailstorm, biting and ripping and dragging it further away from the horde, separating its form from its comrades. The injuries they inflicted healed in moments, but they were keeping it on the ground. They avoided its claws as they rendered fangs into flesh. As quickly as the Wendigo could push one away, the other was attacking again. And then the Wendigo grabbed both wolves by the snouts, slamming their heads together as it regained its footing. It gripped both of them by the throat, spinning while walking forward into the forest. Trees were being crushed and splintered as twin bodies of fur were ploughed into them. Both Tyler and Ryan's claws were digging into the Wendigo's forearms as it finally released them. Ryan flew haplessly through the air as Tyler's claws deeply hooked into its flesh and dragged the monster with him. The Wendigo was under constant surprise as Tyler was learning his enemy. He stayed either far from its reach or too close for it to mount a powerful attack. He would launch a series of bone-crushing bites and then retreat as Ryan would approach from behind, mimicking the other werewolves' strategy. They pushed the monster further and further north until the field was far behind them. Their fight through the forest becoming a momental path of destruction as trees were broken and uprooted by sheer force of bodies being slammed into them, and then launching over them as well. They moved the monster even further onto a long, wide path, and the creature was blown back by another powerful assault, losing balance and falling upon steel cables stretched through the sky at chest level. And the enormous abomination's body seized with convulsions as hundreds of thousands of volts of electricity entered it from the high-tension main transmission wires it found itself entangled with. Bright blue lights flashed into the night sky far in the distance, and with a series of dull explosions as the huge, overloaded transformers at the nearby power station burst into flames. Now the Wendigo hung almost lifelessly from the cables as Tyler gripped its leg in his fangs before ripping it down. The ground shuddered with a resounding thud as the multiple tons of monster hit the snow-covered surface. Ryan's jaws locked around its thin neck, locking it mortally in place. Tyler moved forth menacingly towards the still burning and still smoking chest of the monster as its faintly glowing blue eyes smouldered into his form. And with great force and a terrible announcement of ripping flesh and shattering of a massive ribcage, Tyler's claws tore open its chest, exposing its belly-beating, icy, black heart. His massive jaws closed around the organ as he consumed it before the creature's eyes. The winter wind scattered the ashes of the monster as it slowly disintegrated into a blue flames. Tyler grinned wickedly as only the greatest predator could. Things changed on the battlefield as Tyler's allies began to turn the tide. The hive mind was broken, the bodies no longer regenerated. The dogmen and other werewolves were devastating the horde as the guardians lashed the colossuses into submission. And one by one, the great titanic beings dismembered the massive foes. Tyler and Ryan quickly rejoined the fray, unleashing their hellish assault upon the horde. Further away, still hanging a few feet from the ground by his parachute, Dan Cross came to from his unconscious state, reeling around with his skull ablaze and mouth dry. He pulled his field knife and cut the paracords one at a time. The last drew taut as he braced for impact as his razor-sharp blade easily severed the cord. His feet touched the earth and his knees buckled painfully. He caught himself just barely before he fully hit the frozen mix below him. He ambled painfully towards the tree line's edge as the cold wind rustled the ice-covered trees to the sound of an intense battle taking place. He breached the tree line and stared in awe as moonlight illuminated the horde of undead beings being decimated by creatures of his wildest nightmares. Great, jagged creatures, wood and lightning, were raining death upon the massive abominations, while giant wolves on four legs and smaller bipedal versions shredded through the wraiths as they burst into blue flames and ash. Things that could only be Sasquatches tore their undead victims limb from limb, eliciting the same violent reaction. He stood in amazement and asked himself aloud, "Am I dead or am I dreaming?" A feminine voice that sounded like honey poured over bourbon spoke beside him, startling him nearly into a heart attack. "They killed the antlered thing. Its army has lost its power to defeat death, and no, sir, you are very much awake." He whirled on his heel to see the most beautiful blonde woman he'd ever laid eyes upon. He looked at her and let his head fall. "We're all gonna die here tonight," he resigned to her. "What do you mean?" Stephanie exclaimed. "The battle is all but won." He sighed. "When the commanding officers do not get a response to base from here, in 30 minutes this entire place is going to be blown to Kingdom Come as a final contingency plan," he said, lifting the cracked lens of his watch to his face and pressing the button to illuminate the face in a pale blue backlight. Stephanie stared at him dumbfounded. Of course they would have set up a failsafe in the event that their forces failed. Sergeant Cross looked at her. "There's about 1,000 megatons worth of tactical, nuclear devices, all synchronized to the same controller spread across about 15-mile radius of this encampment, ma'am. There's really no point in running. None of us could make it out of here. And this entire area is going to be reduced to ashes and dirt." "You can't call it off?" she half yelled at him. "No, I don't have the authorization codes. I don't have a clue where they would be, even located. I'm just a pilot. Anyways, what would I even tell them if I could?" "You could tell them the damn truth," Stephanie spat at his feet. "Yeah, like a simple airman, barely ranked high enough to consider being special forces, calling back to base and saying, 'Hey guys, well, everyone either got killed or went MIA. But no worries, a bunch of nicer monsters showed up and killed the bad monsters, so there's no need to blow up 15 square miles of basically nothing.'" He scoffed at her. "If anything, ma'am, they'd hit the kill switch right then and there." Stephanie's head fell towards the blood-soaked snow and sleet-covered ground. All felt hopeless in that moment as she and the soldier crossed the icy wasteland. Across the field, Tyler felled the last wraith with a savage swipe of his claws, all 7 of the 6-inch-long razors of death and destruction, wickedly severing the abomination into flames and ash. The majority of dogmen and werewolves were already disappearing back into the wilderness to where they had originated, silently sprinting across the snow. And Tyler flung his great wolfen head towards the bright moon above, letting loose a howl that boomed for miles across the land. The Sasquatches were long gone, too. Only Tyler and Ryan stood eyeing the huge beings before them. The biggest of the 3 let forth a groan that sounded like it belonged to a large cargo ship flexing at sea. It sounded like being near an amplified grist mill. as the being leaned to bow almost gracefully towards the two wolves that were tiny in comparison, more like mice at the feet of men. The other two beings followed suit with the first, and then, as they righted themselves, both Tyler and Ryan bowed as best they could in their wolf forms. Stephanie reached a pair of wolves and practically screamed the information the soldier had given her. Dan Cross ignored the wolves as he stared up to the black voids in the faces of the Guardians. The Titanic leader groaned again, rather menacingly, as lightning filled his stone fist. Dan Cross drew a breath just before his body was vaporized into nothing by the massive reddish-purple bolt as the Guardian pointed his finger towards the soldier. Both the wolves and Stephanie stared in shock at the horrific display of hatred displayed by the Guardian as the thunder from the attack rattled the ground and echoed all around them. The Guardians, however ancient and silent, understood from reading the mind of the soldier the sheer level of devastation that would take place. They dug their giant stone hands into the cold earth like oversized excavator buckets, and they bore the hole 50 feet deep as the smallest of the trio stepped into the hole, lightning shimmering across its titanic form. It transformed itself into a winding staircase, and Tyler, Ryan, and Stephanie understood the notion. They began descending the wood-laden stone stairs as the other two beings laid over the opening above, fusing their bodies to their brethren. Lightning flashed about in every shade, melting stone to stone, until the three beings were welded into a gigantic supernatural bunker. Only minutes after the three reached the bottom of the stairs, the ground all around them heaved violently, as if an earthquake was tearing through the layers of soil and granite. The beings they were encased within released horrible, deafening screams as their bodies were scorched by atomic fire. And 50 miles away, windows shattered and car alarms sounded. There, and between the epicenter, anyone outside had their skin scorched by the light. Any unfortunate enough to be looking in the direction of the massive blast were instantly blinded. The werewolves, dogmen, and Sasquatches were incinerated as they made their way back to their homes. Around the world, nuclear-bearing superpowers had their breath as alerts jammed computer monitors. World leaders feared the worst as the minutes ticked by. Radioactive fallout rained too, in the form of dust and particles, as a pre-made message from the United States field communication lines. The message announced that a large nuclear weapons depot located in the southeast region of the country had accidentally been detonated. By the early light of pre-dawn, Tyler, Stephanie, and Ryan made their way from the tomb-like sanctuary they escaped annihilation within. The massive Guardians stayed fused together in a natural-looking rock formation as the three moved across the devastated nuclear wasteland. The trees were obliterated, the snow vaporized by the blast. Every bit of evidence had been eviscerated from the face of the earth in the cleansing fury of atomic flames. The trio split, Ryan headed northeast, while Stephanie and Tyler headed southward. The pair moved quickly across the land, Stephanie keeping pace with the big wolf as the distant sounds of helicopters were heard from several directions. Within a short time they found an area where the wilderness, though scorched, had not been totally destroyed. They continued on and on for miles, and finally they came across a farmhouse about 20 miles south from Stephanie's hometown. The home, although heavily damaged, was still standing well enough to provide refuge from the elements. The two entered, finding no one else within the structure, and Tyler seized his duffel bag from her after turning back into his human form. He dressed himself, noting how good it felt to have his hat on his head and his boots on his feet again. He lit himself a cigarette as the pair began rummaging in the kitchen. Among the bounty of food, they found that they needed no preparation, and Tyler found an old set of Chevrolet truck keys. He ate a couple of small bags of chips and a few snack cakes before making his way to a large garage in the backyard. The two doors were unlocked, and so he let himself in. And there, in the dim light filtering through the open door, stood a 1982 Chevrolet Scottsdale, lifted onto 32-inch mud tires and sporting a glossy black paint job. And Tyler approached, releasing a long whistle. It looks very Johnny Cash, Stephanie mused from the door. Tyler inserted a key into the ignition and sighed. The dash lit up with notification lights as the interior gave a familiar buzz that indicated an open door. Tyler knew that the aircraft hangar-like metal structure had acted like a Faraday cage, shielding the truck from most of the electromagnetic waves associated with a nuclear blast. Not to mention that most of the electronics in the truck were all hardwired and old-school tube fused. He turned the ignition, but the truck didn't fire. He looked around and found a small can of gasoline before using a little bit to prime the twin Holly 4-barrel carburetors sitting atop of the aftermarket intake manifold of the big block 454 engine. He knew the stock 7.4 litre was capable of 460 horsepower within a 490 foot-pounds of torque, and there was no telling what type of performance this modified monster could produce. He climbed back into the cab and turned the key while pumping the accelerator. The big V8 roared to life before sputtering once and then roaring again. He warmed the cold engine as Stephanie opened the door to the garage fully. He left the engine running and retrieved his duffel bag. The pair kissed passionately before climbing into the cab of the big pickup. And Tyler wasted no time as Stephanie slid close to him. He put the automatic transmission into drive position and pulled around the house onto the road. Tyler Hillmark lit a Marlboro Red as his new, beautiful blonde lover pressed close to him. The truck faced south towards his home, and he watched the longest period of his time vanish in the rearview mirror as the horrific memories washed over him in stark definition. He knew the road would lead him home, but beyond that the highway was unknown to either of them. The future a blank slate with a massive question mark. Note from the author. I would first and foremost like to thank DMT for taking his time to narrate this series. This has been an absolute dream come true. Next, I want to thank all of the folks who have supported me throughout the duration of my writing process. Folks like Jim Lawrence, Sherry Griffey, and Sharon Dalhart, and so many others. Definitely all of the subscribers and Cryptid crew. The kind words and suggestions, advice and all of the positive comments, it means a lot to me. This has been a very epic and risky journey for me. I've covered a ton of ground and worked with a lot of mythological creatures and beings. I do want to say that this is 100% original and all written from my own thoughts and dreams. I hope everyone enjoyed this series. It has been such an honour to work with DMT and provide entertainment to those around the world. Thank you again so much, and be on the lookout for the Memories of Summer series and the Nebula Files, as they are a continuation of the Nightmare of Winter series. Peace and much love to you all, Mr. Savage. Wow, 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 wow. And another one. Wow. Absolutely wonderful, chest-pounding, riveting stuff there, Mr. Savage. Thank you so much, brother. I'm very honoured to work with yourself, and thank you so much for reaching out to me, brother. Can't wait to get stuck in with the brand new series, as and when you're ready, of course. Really do enjoy your writing. It's very refreshing, very action-packed as well. And I just hope you enjoyed my rendition. And I just hope you enjoyed my rendition. Guys and girls, as ever, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR. Of course, if you believe you can pen the next big hit, or just fancy having a crack at things, please do get in contact with myself at my email, which is dmtforestofear@gmail.com. Thank you so much to each and every single one of you that tunes in time and time again. With your likes, your comments, your shares, really does mean a lot to me as we push towards new adventures and greater things. And so, I hope you're all happy and well, keeping fit and focused. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.